Yeah. Yeah. First conversation meeting with Douglas Dietrich and Prelude interview. Date
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah. That's where she
Date.
recorded. That's where she recorded a Skype conversation and uploaded it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
Yes, honey.
let somebody check YouTube. I created. Well, hang on a minute. Let me check here. Check it now and see. Somebody check there when you get a chance.
Aristides, Brendan, you
Aristides,
gentlemen.
It's running.
Yeah.
It's running great. The live stream's running. We can hear all of us, and the Skype call is live. So you guys proceed.
There it is.
Okay, and I'm recording on my end.
Okay. My lord.
So, honey, are you working tomorrow?
Yeah, but that's okay.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh, Jesus.
Oh, but
What
it's
time?
fine. It's fine. It doesn't matter. It's not a big
Okay.
deal. Okay,
So
let's
we
just
can-
let's just settle in here for a minute and get our
You bet.
bearings.
Yeah. I want you to know I think you're the most diligent, resilient, courageous young lady on earth. I mean, honestly, this was an attack. It was an attack in which they did what was supposed to be technically impossible, and they shut down things on your end and basically a lot of different ends. And this is done to discourage us from ever doing this.
This
is
was
what they do.
this was stressful. I was just like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, I don't know why it's doing it now. It had no problem yesterday, but now it seems to be working fine, I think. And as long as everything's running smoothly,
So our impression, Brendan Zogit, his impression was that we were stuck to a 1 hour time slot with the radio station, and that they kind of had to have you come on and do a little something and then usher you out at the end of the time slot. Was that the case?
no, there's no limit on it at all. And so
good.
I actually spoke with him. He helped me kind of reset my audio, and everything's cool. Okay,
Excellent.
I'm just getting my bearings again so we can get right back in the zone. So I hope that everybody will just bear with us for a minute. I mean, I'm so sorry that we're having these kind of technical issues, but we'll get right into it. I'll turn my camera on in here in a second.
I want all our listeners to know that none of this is Jennifer Hawkins's fault. All of this is an attack that happens to anyone who's sincerely trying to interview me. What we can conclude at this point is that Jennifer is not on the side of the enemy. The way she suffered tonight, they truly fear her interviewing me. So by all means,
Okay,
back to Jen.
let's settle in. Here we go. I'm going to turn my camera on. It shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
Oop. I double clicked it. So,
You're beautiful.
okay. Now, let's get
You're
into this.
stunning.
Let's get in. Thank you. You look wonderful this evening.
Thank you. You're very
Okay.
kind.
So now, you're listening to Gen Arcana on KUAP Troubled Minds Radio Network. Today we're visiting with Mr. Douglas Dietrich. He is the former research librarian for the Department of Defense. I wanted to talk. The reason I'm even here is because he was so kind. I got a hold of him through his live stream on his channel, which I'm going to link that in the description afterwards when I do some editing with the, putting the radio connection through there, and then also Mr. Dietrich's channel. He also has a website, and he's written some books, and we'll get into that a little bit too if he'd like, because that'd be wonderful for you to plug some of your books. And could you please, Mr. Dietrich, tell the listeners a little bit about your early days in the military and how it began that you began to notice. I think you are familiar. Michael Aquino is going to play prominently in this interview, as well as the Presidio case, Satanism in the military, his experience of that, and then we'll go from there. But we're going to start with is what his experience when he was starting out as the librarian for the Department of Defense. And just please give us a nice run through of your experience with that, please.
Yes. Thank you so much. First thing I'd like to ask is our dear friend Aristides, the material science engineer, leave the call so that we can have a half and half visually since we are recording this. We love you dearly, Aristides. But let's have you.
No problem. I appreciate you calling me your time of crisis. All right, I'll let you go, and I'll keep an eye on it.
Thank you. Bless you. Then, of course, Brendan joins. So so Brendan, is there something you want to say before you leave the call? Visually. We're back. Good.
Okay.
Now we've got half an hour, and we can get started. These were helpful friends of ours, and they're like little imps. You have to kind of, it all works out. So I want our lovely Jennifer Hawkins to know something that I'm going to go into how all of it started is kind of like goes into my childhood. It goes into the military background, starts before I was born. So I want everyone to understand that my father was in the Navy for over 30 years. He is the man who raised and guided me. He almost certainly is not my biological father. This is George Joseph Henry Dietrich. He was a Chief Petty Officer of the United States Navy. Is that, honey, you had kind of raised your hand like you wanted to ask a question?
No, I was going to move this, and I decided not to touch anything.
Oh, okay. No, understood. So what happened was that the man who raised and guided me ran away from Eastman Kodak, in a sense. He ran away from his own family, which was heavily involved with Eastman Kodak, which was a defense contract company that had enormous influence in the world at that time, was the high-tech company of its day, and was very much in control of Rochester, New York, certainly to the point where they were able to segment off a huge amount of Rochester, New York. All of this is relevant to how I ultimately wound up working with Michael Aquino, believe it or not. So it does bear retelling and does bear explaining, and gives everyone kind of the essence of how things evolved, how I became the person I became that was so attractive to Michael Aquino. My mother was in Asia at the time, and she had her own backstory. In the case of my father, however, it's more immediately relevant. When it came to the Kodak company, George Eastman developed film development technology that was unprecedented.
Oh,
and
wow.
he developed, yes, yeah. And so what he did was that he was ultimately impacted by this technology. He worked heavily with chemicals, and they wound up poisoning him systemically to the point where he suffered from basically a diseased nervous system. He was chronically in pain, and then ultimately George Eastman killed himself because of the extreme pain he was in. Before he killed himself, one of the few things keeping him alive was that he was trying to change the world, revolutionize it as he had technologically by basically introducing a new calendrical system. And so what he did was he developed his own calendar, what he believed would be a universal business calendar. And this universal business calendar was something that had a certain number of months that were almost metric in nature. So all the months had an even number of days. And this was something that he felt would be a calendar system that all businesses would use, so that all businesses would be on the same time frame. And this would render universal business possible, or have it enter a new phase of evolution. When he presented this to the League of Nations at that time, the precursor to the United Nations after World War I, they did not buy into his idea. And it was shortly after that that he killed himself. But it's important to remember that his control over his own corporate culture was so extreme that that calendar was used within that Kodak company culture. So when he developed his own company town that was part of Rochester, New York, but definitely separated from it, he had it fenced off with razor wire, electrified fencing, and behind that razor wire and electrified fencing was an entire city. We're talking about a Ferris wheels and amusement park, so the kids would not have to go to amusement parks outside. We're talking about its own hospital system, so that all the people who were injured in various chemical burns various chemical explosions, wouldn't have to leave the Kodak company town. They'd be treated in the hospital there by hospital employees. And the reason that this was important to him was because he was not following the federal safety standards for industrial procedures or processing. So this way he had his own mini nation state.
Oh, wow.
And it had its own energy source, its own dynamo system big enough to power an entire city. It was all its own energy system, its own water supply. We're talking about it was its own little world. So when I worked as a Department of Defense librarian, one of the things that I would notice on blueprints concerning bomb sight lenses, sniper scope lenses developed by Kodak Company was they would say this product was made on Kodak Company time. And what they literally meant was you would have to consult their calendar and then cross-reference it with yours to find out when it was made and how long time span it took to make it on your time.
Yeah.
So this is all important because I killed my grandfather. Basically what had happened was my father's father, who had worked at Kodak forever, was poisoned by all of those chemicals, just like George Eastman was. And it rendered him
I've heard
insane.
of that, actually, with the...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes, and just so people understand the gravity of the situation and how real it is, Rochester Medical University has had to deal with a phenomenon where because Rochester's entire water supply has been poisoned by Kodak Company chemicals,
Wow.
Kodak used to produce enormous amounts of color separately. Each color was copyrighted. And so when they would dump these colors into the river, one part of the river would be pure green, another pure red, another pure blue, another pure yellow. And then they would take these bleed-off toxic chemicals and they would pay all the local farmers to bury it in their backyards. They would pay them good money not to ask questions, to keep their mouths shut.
That is crazy.
Yes.
That's
and so what happened?
But as it is, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, it all got into the water table and it all poisoned everybody in all over upstate New York, but particularly Rochester. And so Rochester Medical University deals with a congenital deformity based on this that they call Rochester Dick. This is not, of course, the medical term for it, but basically men are born in Rochester whose penises are right next to their anuses, exactly in the position that a woman's vagina would be.
Wow.
And as a result, this is common because of the chemical poisoning. There was that factor that caused my father, the man who raised and guided me, to run away and join the Navy. And there was also the factor that his father, driven insane by chemicals, was extraordinarily abusive. One of the things that happened was he had like maybe 7 other boys with my father's mother. But my father, I'll say my legal father. My legal father's mother gave birth to at least 7 other boys for this man who was my legal grandfather. And she had, the last boy was the man who raised and guided me, George Joseph Henry Dietrich. He was the only one named George. All of the rest of the brothers were named William after Kaiser Wilhelm. And but he was born last, and his father said, this guy's the runt of the litter, and he told my father's mother, you can have him, you raise him. And so my father was essentially raised differently than all the other boys in the family. There was one girl that was born, the 8th or 9th child, and my grandfather, legal grandfather, broke both her legs so she could not run away while he was raping her.
Gosh, wow.
You know, all of this is important because it's almost certain, well, I was told later on, decades later, by members of the Dietrich family, that he was part of a satanic cult. And ultimately, this cult was connected to the cult of Michael Aquino. So there was already that connection. And in other words, Michael Aquino was made aware of myself through my grandfather.
Okay.
Now, the reason he was made aware of myself through my grandfather was, as I said, I killed him ultimately. What had happened was when the Vietnam War was winding down, my father had the great misfortune of serving on a couple of ships that suffered terribly during the Vietnam War. One of them was the USS Forrestal, and it caught on fire. There was a terrible amount of death. My father was part of the rescue attempts in that ship carrier. My father was a carrier sailor for the most of the time during his career. He originally started in the gunboat patrols in mainland China before World War II because he had joined the Navy when he was so young. He ran away when he was 15, 16 years old. They took him because they would take young boys in those days. As a matter of fact, they were desperate for personnel because, believe it or not, at that time in history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was conducting a crackdown on homosexuality in the Navy. And because he was conducting a crackdown on homosexuality in the Navy, what had happened was that he convinced sailors to seduce other sailors and then turn them in. Espionage in the Navy. By the way, Nemo, thank you for joining us. I'll have to ask you to leave the call because we're conducting a genuine interview now with Jennifer Hawkins, so we want this to be split screen.
But yes,
yeah. Thank you, Nemo. And so when it comes to what had happened with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and what he was doing, they had gotten rid of so many naval personnel, and what they would do is when sailors were discovered in coitus on ships, they would do the same thing generally, is they would drop them off at the San Francisco. And this was how San Francisco gradually became gay, was they gradually dumped so many gay sailors in San Francisco that they became the mecca of a new community, a new subculture. And because they were already busted for being gay and unemployable elsewhere. And therefore, they created their own community in San Francisco. That's how all that got started. In the case of my father, when he ran away from home and joined the Navy, they were so desperate for manpower at that time because Roosevelt was purging all these gays, and the Navy was full of gays because men on ships with nothing else to do wind up usually having, well, sex with each other.
Well,
and so when my father joined the Navy, the first thing they did with him was they said, are you gay? And he said, no. And the doctor said, we're going to prove it. We're going to find out. And he shoved a dildo down his throat. And when my father gagged and his eyes bulged out and he had tears streaming down his face, then the doctor said, see, you're not gay. We'll take you. Okay. He says they were so desperate they took him because he's only 16, but they allowed him in. And so when he joined the Navy at that time, when the Vietnam War was over, he had married my mother at that point. And there's a very important story to be brought in here. At that time, it's very important for Americans to understand, because I don't think Americans really appreciate the kind of world that they live in is not the world that I was born in. I was born in 1966.
Yes.
And I was born right after the legalization of hybrid marriages. As a matter of fact, they wouldn't be legalized until the year after I was born. It's one of the reasons we didn't come to the United States until I was 3 years old. Yeah. But there was a law in the United States against interracial marriage. And so a man who married a wife overseas, especially someone who was not white, and were bringing a child, they legally could not do that, legally couldn't bring the child into the U.S. That was synonymous with another law that was a Uniform Code of Military Justice law, a military code law, where they said that because they were fighting in Japan, Korea, Vietnam, they said, we don't know who the enemy is, but we know they're all Asian. And because of that, no American serviceman was allowed to marry an Asian woman. It was against the law, or rather the military code. And so what happened was they made a movie about this, starring Marlon Brando, a number of other actors, called Sayonara, where they showed all the lovers' suicides. And because they presented this to the public developed a sense of remorse. And then my father, along with multiple other servicemen, was part of a class action lawsuit to sue the U.S. military so that they could marry their Asian war brides. And the Supreme Court of the United States overturned the Uniform Code of Military Justice as unconstitutional in that regard. It's only because of these reasons I was allowed to even come to the United States. So I was born in Taiwan as a Taiwanese national, but because my father was a U.S. serviceman, I was then declared legally a U.S. citizen by naturalization. So I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen. So when we were brought over to the United States, my mother was already rather infamous in intelligence circles because she had been a translator at the diplomatic level throughout World War II. So there was an understanding of who my mother was, and she was under.
Mr.
Yes.
Dietrich.
Yeah.
I'd like. It would be nice if Nemo could. What?
Oh yes, Nemo. Yes, if you could. It said he left the call, but for some reason his symbol's not disappearing, and I wish I knew how to make it disappear.
I don't know. Okay, then go ahead.
Let's try this. Okay, remove from call. There we go.
There we go.
Did it. Yeah.
Okay.
So in terms of our man, shall we say, well, what happened after that was my father thought he could get back into the family will, and he thought he could do that by being a care provider for my grandfather. When he brought me and my mother over to the United States, we went to upstate New York to care for his father in his retirement. None of the other children were doing that. And so my father thought by being the only young son who was the care provider, he would get into the will. And so, unfortunately, because of his insanity, my grandfather, and likely his Satanism, my grandfather basically was beyond abusive. As soon as my mother...
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
I wonder how your grandfather got into being a part of the Satanism too. That's very interesting. You know, this goes way back, doesn't it? It seems to be a family lineage thing.
Yes, definitely. It definitely, I would say that it was probably through Kodak Company, probably defense contracts, some kind of... Kodak Company was obviously a very... it was different from your average company, obviously. And Eastman Kodak may have had a way of keeping people out of unions was probably by getting them involved in the cult instead. It's what makes sense.
That does make sense.
Because if everyone were involved with a kind of anti-church, then they would not be going to the conventional churches and exposing themselves to a lifestyle outside of the company. This is what I understood to have happened. Certainly what the man who raised and guided me, my legal father, intuited. When it came to his bringing my sister, myself, and my mother into Walcott, New York, the home of this individual, my grandfather, to give you an idea of how isolated it is, one young lady who lived in Albany, New York, told myself that she would love to check on my parents' gravestone in upstate New York because my father served in 3 wars. He's got a headstone provided by the Veterans Administration that shows 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. My gang stalkers have threatened to destroy that headstone. So I've always asked people if there's someone who could check on my father's headstone in upstate New York. But this one young lady called me from Albany and said, you know, I really would like to do that. But she told me it would be easier for her to actually get in her car, drive to the New York airport, and take a plane to see me in San Francisco than it would be for her to drive to Walcott, New York. That's how isolated Walcott, New York is.
Okay.
So it's really out in the middle of nowhere. And I found that out, of course, when I buried my parents there. But when it came to when we were children, we were up there with this deranged man. And one of the things that would happen is my mother would go shopping with my father in the town. They'd bring home enough things in bulk for both children. They'd bring home multiple loaves of bread, buckets of ice cream. He would eat it all in one night. He would devour entire buckets of ice cream, entire loaves of bread, and vomit it out and then eat the rest, saying, everything in this house is mine. Everything in this house belongs to me. And he felt that about us. So he proceeded to begin attempting to rape my sister, and mainly because my mother, this is very Japanese, and people may not understand this culture, so it needs just a little bit of explaining. If you ever take a look at the Kabuki theater and they show the ancient Japanese samurai cultural system, they'll show, for instance, the typical thing that would also happen in China and anywhere else when a royal family loses a war, the other family will come in and massacre all the heirs so that they can't have a claim to the throne. And what they'll show is in the samurai culture, when the enemy is looking for who is the heir to the throne, what would happen is most samurai women would throw their own children forward and say, "This is the heir to the throne," so that they would be killed instead of the real heir.
Oh,
That's the sense of
crazy.
samurai loyalty. Well, it's a culture. It's a different culture.
Yep.
And in the case of my mother, because she didn't want me to be despoiled or desecrated by this individual, she would throw my sister in front of him to rape. And that was essentially, my sister would suffer this offense for the early part of her life. Obviously, this scarred her for the rest of her life. When he finally attempted to rape myself orally, my teeth were just coming in, and I bit his penis off.
Wow.
And I remember, this was my first conscious memory. I was 3 years old. My teeth were just coming in. And the only thing I remember is, blood's got to taste better than this. It tasted like turpentine.
Right.
It tasted like turpentine. I remember Peter Moon said Kodak blood, and it's not inappropriate. That's essentially what happened with that. Now, we were told he was dying, and the police told my parents, "You better get out of upstate New York immediately," because the town hated us anyway. They hated us because my father had come home with an Asian bride. And she was hated enough where no one in the town would sell her anything. She would always have to go in with my father in order to purchase anything. No one would deal with her. And so they were literally coming to burn the house down with us in it. So we left immediately, and my father took us to San Francisco. That's how I wound up in San Francisco. And the reason he came here, several reasons. One was, obviously, it's the opposite end of the continent. And also, it was where the Presidio military base was, and as a military veteran, that meant he had access to the base for shopping, for hospital care, and that all of us did as well because we were his military family, his dependents. It's called a military dependent system until you turn 18. Yeah. And so what happened was we were told, basically the police told us that my grandfather was dying, and we simply accepted that. It wasn't until years later I found out he had survived and lingered for a few more years, but he ultimately died. And this is what everyone else, all the other children came in to take care of him while he was on life support for a number of years, and they all got in the will, and he basically then died. But because in those days there was no internet, and they were not calling us or talking to us, we had no way of knowing that he was alive. There was nothing in the papers, and we thought they had covered it up in secret because of the nature of his death. So it just goes to show there's also a time lag, a difference between the date of his death and the date of his death, because he died on Kodak company time. Right. So there's still a mystery as to exactly when he died. Still a mystery as to exactly when he died. And all that being said, that gives you some idea of how Aquino had heard of me, because Aquino later related to me he had heard about what I had done to my grandfather. And so apparently the Satanic Network reported to him, and he was watching me like a hawk from that point forward. Now, this becomes key to how I wound up working and liaising with Michael Aquino. He knew about my mother's work in Asia. He knew about my killing my grandfather, which ultimately I did. And he knew about what had happened with a number of other things along the way. I certainly know I was monitored while I was growing up. One of the things that would happen all the while I was growing up is strangers would call on the telephone, and they would conduct surveys. And of course, I would just be anxious to talk to people, happy to talk to people. But who would conduct surveys with a child who's like 9, 8, 10, 11 years old?
So they would they'd call on the, you hear me okay, right?
Yeah, I hear you.
So they would call on the phone.
Yeah.
And just kind of, you'd pick up the phone. Would they ask for you, or you're the one who answered the phone?
It was just I would be the one to answer the phone, because oftentimes my parents were gone. My father took years to overcome his alcoholism. And my mother was usually working or out, for lack of a better word. We can get into that another time. She had other activities, not prostituting herself, I assure anyone. Not that I would judge anything negative about that.
Right.
If that was what she had done, I would be open about it, but that's not what she was doing.
Right.
But some other time it's exactly what she was doing. But
so she wasn't home, but you were home, and the phone would ring. How old were you, do you think?
Oh, literally, it started when I was 7 years old, at least, maybe 6. And of course, I'd pick up the phone and just be happy to talk for hours to
And they
whoever.
would just kind of ask you, just make a conversation and then sort of just conversate with you and get
Well,
information.
yeah, they would always present it as, oh, well, and it would be different people, men or woman, but they would always say, oh, this is a survey. We're conducting a survey.
Mhm.
And then ask me questions about what do you feel about the political situation in East Asia? What do you feel about this
Okay.
product? Yeah.
Now,
Do you,
so this rundown of from your childhood of the way that so you had a say your family already had a satanic lineage occurring, and then you eventually decide to were you groomed to go into the military, or did you find your way um, into it without any did you choose to go into the military yourself? Explain to tell me how you got into the military, where you and then to where the position that you were in with the Department of Defense. Tell me
yes,
how. Go
yes.
ahead, and
So
then
let's make some disambiguations first for our listeners. Ultimately, I did join the military. It was the stupidest thing I ever did. It was something that yet was almost inevitable, just based on my background. At the same time, the Department of Defense, which I entered into first, is not the military; it's civilian. So
yes,
technically,
sorry,
yeah,
sorry. Go
yeah.
ahead.
So very important to disambiguate that. It is involved with the military, but the military theoretically is under a civilian chain of command. But just to explain to everyone how I got into it, the phone calls were important. These surveys display that I was obviously being monitored because nobody is going to take a survey with a young child growing up. It's something I never thought about until, of course, I became more mature.
Mm-hmm.
But when I did wind up working with the military, there were several confluent events. It's important to remember that at the time in the 80s, in late 70s, early 80s, San Francisco was a cult city, and there was a particular individual named Jim Jones who organized a cult based on the greater Bay Area population, especially attracting many disenfranchised blacks from Oakland. This individual wound up committing what was called the Jonestown Massacre, and
Yes.
within a week, literally within a period of maybe about 10 days, you've got the assassination of the mayor of San Francisco. Now, the individual who committed that assassination was a former San Francisco police officer named Dan White. He was supposed to be the stereotypical good Irish Catholic boy, and he felt deeply offended when he lost his job to a gay man who was infamously gay, not simply gay, but outwardly gay and outspokenly gay, and that was Harvey Milk. Harvey Milk was known as the mayor of Castro Street. This is important. He was one of the men who originated the U.S. Navy SEALs. He was one of the underwater demolition teams experts in the U.S. Navy during the Korean War,
Wow.
and he has a ship named after him. There is a U.S. Navy ship named after Harvey Milk, this infamously gay pedophile, because he would exploit young boys. That this is a known fact. It's not slander. This is something that he needs to be confronted as a part of our history, and we have to ask why this man's face is on stamps, why there's a U.S. Navy ship named after him, that he was one of the founders of the Navy SEALs ultimately. But anyhow, Harvey Milk wound up getting the job of supervisor that used to belong to Dan White. He was in the office with George Moscone, the mayor of San Francisco, and in that same room was a lady named Leanne Prifty, who was Albanian ethnically, an ethnic Albanian, and she worked with the U.S. State Department at night with Radio Free Europe. So she would conduct radio broadcasts behind the Iron Curtain to Albanians who were a very radical, extremist communist nation at the time. And she would speak the language of Shqipteri, the Illyrian language. And this is important, all connected with how I wound up with Michael Aquino. Basically, this woman was considered a lap secretary as her day job for George Moscone. So basically, she wasn't like an official secretary, but she basically gave him blowjobs under the table. And so she happened to be there in the office when Dan White was conferring with George Moscone. Harvey Milk was conferring with George Moscone.
Sorry, go ahead.
Dan White walked in as a former police officer. He could openly carry a weapon and no one would stop him. He was a former SFPD. So when he walked into City Hall, nobody stopped him, and he went to the mayor's office, pulled his gun out, and Leanne Prifty stood up to stop him. He pushed her to the ground and said, "I'm too much of a gentleman to shoot a lady," and proceeded to kill the other two men. Now, he never spent a day in jail. He never spent a minute in jail. He went to trial, and his lawyer said he was all sugarized, all hyped up on too many Twinkies. It was called the Twinkie defense. And they let him go. And
that's
went
crazy.
home. Yeah, he went home, and then later on, 7 years later, like he suddenly had remote control order, he blew his brains out. But what happened was that Dianne Feinstein, she became mayoress of San Francisco, not by election, but by simply being in line of secession. So by line of secession, without votes, she became the mayoress of San Francisco, and her political career skyrocketed. Now, this is important. At the same time, shortly after that, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, began shooting and killing people in California. And the police department in Los Angeles was tracking the weapon that was being used. They were able to identify the caliber, the bore, the manufacturer, and they were this close to capturing Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
Yeah.
And they shared their information, of course, with other police departments, including SFPD, San Francisco Police Department. And then Dianne Feinstein got on national television and warned the Night Stalker about this. She said, I want people to know that the police are on track. They've got the weapon that the Night Stalker is using identified, and unless he changes his weapon, he's going to get caught.
That's
and
crazy.
after that, he started charging his weapons. Yeah, changing them. And he was able to escape capture for many more months, if not a few years, thanks to Dianne Feinstein. Now, all of this is relevant because what happened was Leanne Prifty, when Dianne Feinstein became mayoress, she said, everyone thinks I'm a dyke. They think I'm a lesbian, and I don't need you in here to reinforce that. That's what she said to Leanne Prifty. She says, I don't need no goddamn lap secretary. You're fired. And so Leanne Prifty was fired. She wound up basically working at John O'Connell Vocational Institute of Technology, which it was this nowhere school. It's not a high school, just so people understand that.
Right.
A high school is where a person goes to graduate and then go to a college. You go to a college after a high school. When you go to a vocational institute, you're supposed to get a job.
Mm-hmm.
You're supposed to get employed. Now, John O'Connell Vocational Institute was infamous that nobody got employed. They called it San Quentin Prep. Basically, it was a gang school. The gangs had taken over the shops, and they were using them to tattoo each other. all this stuff. It was just Latino gangs in the middle of a barrio in San Francisco. What used to be an Irish district at that point, between Haight and Bryant and Treat Street. This was a entire city block was John O'Connell because it used to be an auto manufacturing building, and that's why it had all these shops.
Yeah.
To teach kids, how to fix cars and crap. And but nobody was learning, and everybody was basically gangbanging. And what happened was that while I was attending there, and she happens to be a secretary in this hellhole,
Right.
she puts the make on me, invites me to her home, and I began sleeping with this lady. And that's when she told me, hey, there's a summer job opening in the Presidio. You go there all the time anyway with your dad, shopping at the post exchange, and you got the military dependence ID card. Why don't you get this summer job at the library, and you'll really be making bank? And I said, good idea. So I applied for the summer job. I got it. I was a librarian's aide, shelving
Yeah.
books. thanks to this Albanian spy who was working with the State Department and broadcasting in the Illyrian language behind the Iron Curtain at night,
Right.
I get this job. And so when...
Can I, just real quick, do you want to take just a second and then come back where you're taking the job? Because, do you want
need to take a break?
For like a minute, just.
Oh, sure.
But I'll be right.
Why don't we do that?
Because I was messing with that tech stuff and.
Oh, honey, take your time.
But,
take your time. What we could do is I'll just shut up and I'll
you take a minute too, just a second, and I'm not gonna do anything but just mute and like for a second.
Yeah. Don't worry. I'll just sit here and breathe. I'll sit here and breathe till you get.
I'm gonna do the same too. And if you want to keep talking or anything like that, but I'll be right back. Or if you want to take the break as well, it's good to go.
I'll just sit here and veg out. You just let me know when you're ready to talk again.
I'll be right back.
Yeah, take your time. Yeah. So. It was so good, of course, to just get this done tonight. They do everything they can to discourage us and to basically drive us into despair. And what they did tonight was technically impossible. They knocked off all our audio for all three of us. It was definitely a nightmare scenario. This young lady is so resilient, and you really have to admire her, maintain her in your thoughts and prayers. She seems to be on the side of the good guys. I always have to be suspect, of course. Understand that people come up and they're like ducks in a shooting gallery, just on an assembly line, telling me that they're interested or that they want to interview me, and there's usually an attempt at an ambush, and that doesn't look like what's going on here. So I do want everyone to appreciate that fact, and of course have the deepest respect for what this young lady went through tonight, and of course the stress involved with that could impact anyone. And I think Aristides was typing something for a minute there. He's welcome to continue.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was just telling everybody to
I'm back.
You and
I'm a little chilly as well, so just don't mind me.
Don't worry, honey. Yeah, take your time.
Anyway,
by the way, I was telling everyone to maintain you in their thoughts and prayers and to hold you in the highest respect for everything you went through tonight. That you're very much courageous. That this was an example of an extreme attack, and you weathered it. You weathered it.
It was interesting. I'm just glad we got it figured out.
Yeah.
Now I'm just gonna get a little, cause I got a little chilly. Okay, so I have to scoot this way. There we go.
So about how I got the job at the library.
Hang on. Yep.
Take your time.
Now, okay, so this lady, she tells you maybe you should think about, picking up a job there, and your father already goes there, and so you do go, and now go ahead.
Yeah, basically this chick pillow talks me into into the road that leads me straight to hell. Yeah, that's pretty much what happened. So let's put it this way: when we are dealing with someone like to rephrase what Jennifer Hawkins just said, so everyone understands. Because I was a military dependent, I had my own military ID card for a family member, what's called a military dependent ID card for the Presidio, meaning any military base, really, any open base. It wouldn't be like I couldn't go into Area 51, but I could go into a normal conventional military base and use their post exchange, as it's called, meaning their shopping center or their hospital. If I needed medical attention, I had access to medical treatment for free at these hospitals because I was a military family member until I turned 18. So I was obviously younger than 18. I was 16 years of age at the most. In fact, I was probably, I was around 16. So this was after the blood transfusion, which occurred at the age of 14. So I was 16 years of age.
Now a blood transfusion. What was that? I mean, I know what it is, but what reference to?
Yeah, so just so people understand who are listening to us, what had happened was when I was growing up, and we'll get back to the job. We'll get back to the job and how I wound up working with Michael Aquino. But this is important. This is important because it again showed he was monitoring me. Just so people know, basically my home environment was beyond stressful. My parents dearly loved each other, but my father was dealing with complex post-traumatic stress disorder and was an alcoholic. He was not a violent alcoholic, but he was not a pleasant alcoholic. And he ultimately overcame that, to his credit, which was why I loved him, took care of him till the day he died.
Yeah.
But he was someone who also cooperated with my mother in caring for us. All credit there. But because of the environment outside the home directly, meaning right outside our door, the moment we left the door, it was dangerous as hell. We were in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, which got that name because cops were paid hazard duty pay and could afford tenderloin steak every night of the year. So it was, I can guarantee you this, I've served in war zones all over the world. I've been in combat more than most enlisted servicemen in the military. And I can tell you, no place on earth that I've ever seen has been worse than the San Francisco Tenderloin. It's the most dangerous area in the world. And so I grew up in there with that level of danger. I was under protection by a Chinese gang. I joined a Chinese gang to survive. And basically, my mother's training also helped because my mother came from a clan background of what the Americans would consider to be ninja. Okay, that's I hate that name now with what Hollywood has done to that. And they are not what Hollywood has portrayed them as. Historically, yes, to a degree, but many variations. Let's just say I received martial arts training. For now, we can go into that again later, the depths or the details thereof, and they do matter. But what happened was that at the time that my mother enabled me to survive such a violent environment, I had some training from my father as well, different little tips here, all the rest of that. I also went to violent schools. The gangs were very active at that time. The Chinatown gangs had conducted massacres in the Golden Dragon restaurant. The Watching and the Joe Boy gangs were recruiting from schoolyards. We literally had shootings, axe fights in schoolyards. Axe fights.
That's crazy.
To give you an example of how bad it was, my gang brother, Beaver, he went to Galileo High School, and that's the same high school that produced O.J. Simpson.
Oh, wow. That's weird. Yeah.
Yeah. And O.J. Simpson even visited to give a pep talk when my gang brother Beaver had joined the football team.
That's crazy.
And they used to have signs right outside the high school on various shops and laundromats that would say, "No Galileo High School students beyond this point." That's how violent they were. No one would let them in any business establishment. But anyhow, all that being said, all that stress combined with several other factors led to my suffering a bleeding duodenal ulcer. Now, in those days, they considered that a psychiatric issue. It was something that happened to chief executive officers, to military commanders, to presidents. It was considered the result of stress of too much responsibility. And so I saw the psychiatrists, several of them, at Letterman Army Medical Center. And this was while I was recuperating, and understand that my bleeding duodenal ulcer in those days, this was before some crazy Australian doctor, a total charlatan and a fraud, injected himself full of H. pylori virus and triggered his own bleeding duodenal ulcer. And since then, they've said that, if you have an ulcer, you're infected with this virus, and they give you antibiotics. Now, by the way, that doesn't happen unless you inject yourself full of the H. pylori virus. So it is a stress symptom.
Right.
But they no longer recognize it as such. In those days, they did. So they said, aside from all the psychiatric issues that they dealt with for a period of time where I was put on Valium and lithium and under observation, one of the things that happened was they lied to my parents And I know they lied. We can go into that later. But what had happened was that my parents were told, your son's bleeding out. The ulcer is so extreme that your son's going to lose all his blood and die. And they said that he needs a full body blood transfusion. And because the blood market has crashed, and this requires some explaining here, just a little bit of a tangent so people understand. At that time, in those days, they used to pay homeless hobos and alcoholics and prostitutes money to give their blood.
Oh.
And so street people used to donate blood to blood banks. And when enough of them became, with the advent of AIDS, infected, they were already infesting the blood supply with every STD known to man and many other communicable diseases. But with the advent of AIDS, things reached a crisis point, a critical point that was massive. Just to give you an idea of how massive it was, and this directly impacted myself, you had the governor of Arkansas, William Jefferson Clinton, and his wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Right.
She had gone to school in England, where she had been sorority sisters with two of the most powerful Muslim women in the world. They were part of a sorority called Hell's Harlots. And while they were there, one of them, Tansu Siller, became the prime ministress of Turkey. She was so butch, she made her husband take her last name in a Muslim country, no less. The other became Benazir Bhutto, or was Benazir Bhutto. She was the princess of Pakistan. This is very relevant. When she was in charge of Pakistan, Pakistan had gone through a series of the largest wars since World War II. The most massive tank battles in the world took place in the far desert between India and Pakistan, and they had gone almost nuclear. They both acquired nuclear weapons. So at the time that they were heading towards another war, because the blood supply was so bad, and one of the reasons it was getting worse was Governor Clinton in Arkansas. This was a contributing factor among many others. He had ordered all the prisoners to donate blood. And he said that way he looked like he was being generous, being charitable. But all these prisoners, of course, were all screwing each other and infecting each other with everything up to and including AIDS. So he was further crashing the blood supply. His wife knew this, and his wife had stock in the blood market. And she sold short, and she called her sorority sister, Benazir Bhutto, and told her about the situation. Benazir Bhutto took advantage of it. You see, Benazir Bhutto said, hey, we're headed towards another Indo-Pakistani war, and we're going to need a lot of blood for injured soldiers. So she told the commanding officers, give the soldiers the order to contribute blood, all of them. I want them all to give a pint of blood so we'll have enough of a backup. And then she gave separate orders to her medics, the corpsmen, and she told, basically what happened was the medics following her orders, when all the soldiers came in to contribute blood, they strapped them down and they drained them dry.
Oh my gosh.
Took all their blood.
Are you kidding? Like that? No,
Yeah.
of course not.
Yeah.
So
and the reason they did this
go ahead.
was because they all had to take tests when they entered the military. So it was all tested blood. And so it was all pure blood, all clean blood. And when the blood market crashed, Benazir Bhutto approached the blood market and told the world, I've got clean blood, thousands of gallons of it.
The blood market, I've
And-
never even thought of that at all.
And
That's insane.
Yeah, and she
But
said,
yes,
I
of
want
course
top
there
dollar.
would be. Of course there
Yeah.
would be.
Yes, and she said, I want top dollar.
Yeah.
And so she made herself a multi-millionaire, at least, a multi-millionaires. She fled to London because she had killed 20,000 of her own troops. 20,000 of her own troops. Then when, years later, she went back to Pakistan, when her sorority sister, Hillary Clinton, was running for president, Hillary Clinton was so confident she was going to win, she called Benazir Bhutto and said, you can go back to Pakistan because when I become presidentress, I'll support you. And Benazir Bhutto went back to Pakistan while Hillary Clinton was running for president. And the moment she stepped off the plane, a suicide bomber whose dad had been killed by her tried to kill her. He blew up, killed 20 people, but missed her. She got into an armored car, was being driven on the way to her residence, and then another suicide bomber threw himself under the armored car and blew himself up, and this killed her. She died the way that soldiers in Afghanistan died, basically by a traumatic brain injury, because the explosion blew her up against the ceiling of the armored car and it smashed her brains out. That was how she died. But all of this was inevitable, and it was all part of the story of the crash of the blood market. So it was around this time of the 80s when the blood market had crashed. My parents were told that your son's bleeding out, there's no blood available, and they knew about everything going on in the world, and so they assumed it to be true. And that's when Dr. John Henry Hagman, who anybody can look up, his name's John Henry, and then Hagman, like in Hag, and then man with a double N. Hag, man, M-A-N-N. John Henry Hagman is a criminal. He's killed hundreds of people at least, more likely thousands. John Henry Hagman was responsible for grisly medical experiments. He approached my parents and told them, we have nanoplasma, what he called nanoplasma, available to put into your son, a synthetic plasma. Everybody we've transferred it into so far has died, but your son's younger and he'll probably be resilient. We're hoping he can adapt it to his body and that he'll survive. But other than that, we have no blood to offer. So of course my parents said, use it. And that's when John Henry Hagman killed me. I was clinically dead for 24 to 48 hours.
How old were you at this point again? I'm sorry.
14. And so I was 14 years old, and I died. My first death, the first time I was clinically dead. There were plenty of others.
Right.
And then what happened was that John Henry Hagman, basically, so people understand the context here, the California economy is enormous. The California economy alone is larger than that of the United Kingdom. It is so large, it is now surpassing that of United Germany. The only nations on earth that have an economy larger than California's are Communist China, the Empire of Japan, and the United States itself, only because California is part of the United States.
Right.
So when you've got an economy that large and a population this big, we have the highest paid uniformed police service in the world in California. It's the California Prison Guard system. And their union is so powerful that they made a deal with the United States Army that if California prisoners, of which we have many, volunteered for dangerous experiments, they'd get gubernatorial pardons on death sentences, they'd get shortened life sentences, they'd get prison privileges, depending on the grade of risk with the experiment. So thousands of prisoners were experimented on at Letterman Army Medical Center, and thousands of them died. All of it legal, because they signed their rights away to be volunteers for military experiments. And military doctors do not swear the Hippocratic Oath. So when these prisoners were doing this, I had to provide them as a librarian later in my career reading material for prisoners who were kept for months at Letterman under experimental conditions. Many of them kept till they went insane, fed nothing but salmon for 6 to 9 months, salmon fish till they turned pink, crap like that.
That's
Just
crazy. Yeah.
Yes, silly experiments, some of them, many of them deadly. But when it came to myself, this was the background. So they were conducting all these experiments, and they had this experimental plasma. When I reanimated, literally reanimated, I originally had blood that was my mother's blood, O negative, one of the rarest blood types in the world. When I reanimated, my blood was O positive, a universal donor almost. I had switched polarities.
So that's incredible, really. I've never heard of anything like that.
It's medically supposed to be impossible, but my bone marrow was able to process this artificial plasma, and obviously they haven't used it much since.
Right.
There's been a few experiments we suspect with a lot of circumstantial evidence, but in terms of my case, I was bleach white for years because it was white blood. It's white blood. It's white synthetic nanoplasma. I was like white as a sheet of typing paper for years, months and months, if not years, before I normalized. And Asians were scared to death of me because white is the color of death in Asia. I was looked upon as truly a ghost in the Asian community.
Right.
But this was when I was 14. At the same time, they wanted to see if this would pass on. That, okay, he survived. Let's see if he can pass on the traits of nanoplasma, which were enhanced processing capability, other improved, basically enhanced processing ability, improved healing, a number of other phenomena. They wanted to see if it would pass on. So they sent in a young girl to have sex with me for the 2 weeks I was there. That was all the psychiatric observation that was going on.
Right.
So here they were pumping me full of Valium and lithium. I had a whole wing of the hospital to myself, and a young lady was coming in to have sex with me 3 times a day. I had nothing to complain about. But at the same time, I do want people to understand that was a prelude, because during that time this young lady was having sex with me, she kept talking about the old man. The old man sent me here. I basically had undergone a lot of things for him in the past. He owes me, and she felt that this was a relief from other things she had done. This girl did not have a name, just so people understand that. We're going to write more of the details about this in the book. I want people to understand this was obviously a traumatic event in its own. Obviously, I enjoyed the sex, but I want people to understand how traumatic this was. This woman was essentially a slave.
Right.
And she was a young lady who was barely 18. I don't even know if she was legal age. I do know she was older than me, but only by a few years.
Right.
But this young lady herself never had a name. She had a serial number, and that was all she was known by. And so I do want people to understand this was where I began to understand the intricacies of the
So they were
evil.
doing this from a clinical perspective to try to see if they could, when she would then, were they taking her embryos, or were they going to have, like, where she would give birth somehow or something?
This is an excellent question. This is an excellent question because the one thing we do know about John Henry Hagman, if anybody looks up John Henry Hagman, they're going to find out he conducted a lot of sexual experiments. He would have his students have sex with each other.
Yeah, that's very common. That's
Yes.
People might not realize that, but this is actually very typical of these, go ahead.
Thank you. And he would inject ketamine in people. He would also drain their bodies completely of blood and then refill them with blood again to reanimate them. This was something he had done before with conventional blood. And many of the people were left, his victims, because of the ketamine and various other experiments, unable to ever have an erection again. He left them sterile for life, etc. So this was par for the course with his kind of experimentation. And what had also happened was with this young lady, I have no doubt they probably extracted a number of her eggs, but ultimately I was to find out years later she had delivered a child by me, and this was their ultimate intent, was to find out if my traits that had been enhanced, the healing and processing abilities by the nanoplasma, if they would be inherited. That was their ultimate objective.
Right.
When both my parents died, and we are going to get back to the library job very soon, but when both my parents died, I was almost homeless. And San Francisco, the city and county of San Francisco is one of the few cities that's also a county. They are one of the few places in the world, probably the only place in the world, that has insurance for homeless people. So which is why so many homeless people come here. But when I was on the borderline of homelessness, I went in to process for benefits. And when I processed for benefits, I was ushered into this building like a labyrinthine maze of cubicles. I was with a staff worker, a social worker, who had me in a cubicle looking at his computer. And he turned towards me and said, "Mr. Dietrich, what about your daughter?" I said, "Daughter?" And he said, "Yes, you gave birth to her, you fathered her when," and he looked at the computer and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, you were 14 years old when you fathered her. You're not legally responsible." And I said, "But please, tell me more." And he said, "This is not open for discussion.
Right.
We will say no more of this."
So, I mean, I understand. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And so I know for a fact I fathered a daughter with this girl. We, by circumstantial evidence, feel we might have found out who it was. I'll go into that another time. She suffered enough. For now, I've certainly been public about it before, but to continue with our main narrative. So all of this had happened when I was 14. By the time I was 16, when I was with Leanne Prifty, and she pillow talked me into this job, and I wound up getting employed, it was very quickly that Michael Aquino personally requested me to be his liaison, meaning his gopher, kind of like a person who acted as a mobile secretary, if you will. And he was someone who took me in as an intern, basically a sorcerer's apprentice. And during this time, it's important to realize that I had already become a military reference technician. While I was working these jobs as a librarian's aide, I had graduated early from John O'Connell Vocational Institute, and I also had entered City College. I did not go straight to a job. Of course, nobody who graduated from that school ever got employed. They never got employed at any trade that they were supposed to get employed in, because none of them learned anything other than gangbanging. But when I went into City College...
Every now and then, it gets a little, like the feed does, on my end and yours, but it's on my side. But it does pick back up again, so...
Oh, it's on both our sides. Yeah, the Skype will glitch, and then it'll
but it's fine. Anyway, go ahead, please.
And thank you. And so what had happened was that when I was going to City College of San Francisco, I was taking all kinds of credits, far more than the normal student. Literally, at one point, I was taking 25 full credits at once, a full credit load of about a quarter of 100 credits, and I was an honor student on the honor roll of City College of San Francisco. So what happened was, obviously, I was processing very quickly, handling a lot of academics, physically fit. Michael Aquino, of course.
Yes, 1 second. So the transfusions, how did you feel that it affected and changed you? In what way did you feel? How did you feel? I mean, if it's, it would tell me how.
I felt great.
I mean, you can't tell that your blood's a different blood type now. But I mean, that's interesting on the chemical level. But you must have felt, well,
it was,
or you couldn't, or it didn't really affect that way. It was just the blood. So it's an amazing process, though, that they were able to do that.
Well, let's put it this way. People need to understand that in the Soviet Union, when they were doing research on vampires, which, just so people know, I wrote a book called Vampirology. It is half the book. We need to get more purchases of it before we can justify the expansion and revision and provide the history behind the physiology that is exposed in that book. Yeah. The Soviet Union was one of the few states that actually officially went into deep investigation of the phenomenon of vampirism. And one of the things that they discovered about their attitude towards blood was that it was, quote unquote, a liquid organ. And it was during the tuberculosis plague that overtook the Soviet Union in the early days of Stalinism that there was one doctor named Bodanov who gave his full body blood transfusion of his blood, which he had an immunity to tuberculosis. He volunteered to have all his blood transferred into a tuberculosis patient who was dying, and he saved the patient but died himself. But this is like his way of escape from Stalinism, was basically what it was. But the blood is something obviously mystical, almost on a mystical level of impact, and it is obviously important. People intuitively know this, but the important thing to understand is that how I felt with this nanoplasma, when I say I felt great, sure, but at the same time, I could easily, and some would claim that this was one of the reasons for all the psychiatric observation, by the way. I was processing so quickly that I almost went insane. It's very difficult to comprehend when you start processing things so quickly that before, whereas I had an artistic skill, I began to illustrate at that point in my life with an almost photographic level of detail. This, of course, is still a different type of illustration technique than most people are familiar with, and requires explaining because a lot of people don't draw anymore. They work with computers, and they do computer illustration. They don't have what we used to have with professional illustration, and they don't understand the techniques we used to use for people who would illustrate for comic books and stuff. It's called storyboarding.
Right.
But yeah. But when it's just an example. I became able to illustrate better. I became a very talented illustrator. I was able to memorize things in those days, almost photographically. Now, understand, in order to maintain my sanity, over the years, I began to abuse a lot of recreational drugs to intentionally slow the processing down, because the processing is just, it otherwise is not healthy. It's not healthy. And so I do want people to understand the impact as well was healing. As I've mentioned before, say for instance, so people understand this, and then we'll get back to working with Aquino and what he said about how I got hired. I do want people to understand that when it comes to, say for instance, how this blood impacted me, I was in the Gulf War. And this was what Americans call the first Gulf War. Really, they should call it Bush War I, Bush War II, because the first Gulf War was really between Iran and Iraq and lasted almost 10 years, and 1 million people died at least. So the American Gulf War was Gulf War II, and the invasion of Iraq was really Gulf War III. Just so people understand that historically. But when it came to Operation Desert Storm, I was exposed to cyclosorine nerve gas. And everybody needs to understand, this is on my medical records. This is incontestable.
Right.
So I was exposed to cyclosorine nerve gas to the point where basically what had happened was my lungs began to collapse. It happened like at some point, they were so scarred by the nerve gas that they developed blisters. Very large blisters in my lungs. And then eventually what happened was they scrolled down and collapsed one time. And then what happened was that when that took place, just so people understand the gravity of this situation, most stab wounds or bullet wounds in the torso, unless they penetrate the heart directly and kill you, obviously you're not going to die immediately. But what happens is your lung will more than likely collapse.
Right.
Because it'll be penetrated by a bullet or a knife. Then what kills you is that vacuum becomes filled with blood and mucus and pus, and it begins to pressure against the heart until you do die. So most people who die of knife or gun, bullet or blade injuries, they die of a collapsed lung. So this is serious business. And what had happened was that in my case, I called the San Francisco paramedics, who, there's some good ones out there, but I have not had good experiences in general. And so they showed up, two idiots showed up at my home, and they, the little oxygen clip, they put the little oxygen clip on my finger, and they said, "You're breathing fine. What you're having is a panic attack." And they said, "Why don't you just relax and, leave us alone?" And they went away. By the way, what they did was completely illegal. When you call an ambulance, they are required by law to take you.
Right.
They don't have a choice.
Right.
So
that's ridiculous.
So these were criminals. Yeah. Anyway, but all that being articulated, so then my gang brother took me to a meal. And all the while I'm sitting there like, and then I start turning blue, like my shirt. God. And while I'm turning blue, he said, "Man, you don't look so good." I said,
"Oh my gosh."
Yeah, and I said, "Take me to the hospital, Daniel." And he said, "Okay." So he drove me to the emergency room. But this is where we get into
not
the
funny.
phenomenon.
I don't know why I'm laughing. I'm so sorry.
No, it's funny as hell. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's funny as hell.
Okay.
I ought to tell you a story about
It's
Brendan
the way
Zoget
you're telling
sometime.
it. The way that you're telling it is.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah. And then I'll tell you a story about Brendan Zoget sometime, and you'll die laughing with the shit that happened to him. But anyhow, in my case, so this is where we get to the case of Chinese doctors. Now, I do want people to understand this. Obviously, I'm I'm half Asian, I can say this. I do want people to understand that the Asian community has cultural tendencies that can be positive and or negative. And being gung-ho Confucianist about studying is both a positive and a negative. It's not always a good thing. And what happens in a lot of Chinese families in particular is the poor kid's born and the parents say, you're going to be a doctor.
Right.
There's no choice. It's not what you want to grow up to be or what do you want. It's, you're going to be a doctor. And there's
Right.
a lot of Chinese kids that just grow up hating what they're doing. They're completely resentful. And for Americans who don't comprehend this, becoming a doctor, by the time you get your medical degree, you're 40. You're 40 years old. You spend like 10 years minimum after graduating with a master's degree, getting that medical degree in what's essentially a student phase of 10 years. And so you've blown your life. If you're going to be a doctor, there's nothing else you're ever going to be in any normal situation. So a lot of these Chinese kids are miserable. Now, Chinese doctors can be the best in the world. I have a Chinese doctor now. I think he's fine as my general practitioner, but a lot of them, they're psychotic. They don't want to be there, and they'll kill you. And so I ran into one of those. So basically, I'm put into the emergency room. At this point, I'm blue, literally blue. I'm brought in, and then the Chinese doctor gets a chest tube out. He says, into my ear, I'm going to fucking kill you. And then he rammed the chest tube through like he was harpooning a whale.
Are you? That's crazy. Wow.
He jammed it to me like he was staking a vampire in a movie. And by some miracle, he missed my heart. But he collapsed the other lung.
Unbelievable.
And I died again. I clinically died. I was clinically dead.
Yeah.
And then by the time I reanimated, some 24 hours later, I had 2 chest tubes in me, holding my lungs up. And if you can imagine the pain of plastic, serrated plastic against your ribs, holding my lungs up that were reinflated, and I'm breathing just, gasping for air. And while I come to, there's this female medical student, for lack of a better word. They hate that term. The teachers are called attending, I think. I forget what the doctors on the floor, basically the students, are called. But in those days, they used to put them through this crush where they were like testing this macho, toxic endurance.
Let's check I haven't been looking at the chat at all for YouTube.
But when it came to, when I came to, this doctor who was like the medical student looking at me, her name was Dr. Doof something. I only remember the first name. It was a hyphenated name because I thought of her as a doofus, D-U-F-F. And I kept wondering, why am I so scared of this woman? Why am I so scared of this? Why did she frighten me so much? I realized what it was. She had a 1,000-yard stare because she had been awake for 3 days. She'd been awake for 3 days. She sent me home, by the way, without stitching up my chest tube sites.
Yeah.
She put Band-Aids on them.
Oh, goodness, man. I can't do it that way. Just 1 second. I have to look at it's going to pull the actual thing up. It doesn't matter right now. Let's say hello to, even though it's going to pull everything aside, but I wanted to look at the chat. This is completely new to me, everyone. So, I know it's pulling up. What you're seeing right now is just this, but, and there might be a delay, but I want to say hello to, let's look at everybody in the chat for just a minute. Mr. Dietrich, I'm sorry to interrupt. And then, but only for a few minutes because we're in the middle of an interview, but I hope you guys are doing good. It looks like Algorithm is here. Jay, Mike, Smurf, Liam, a lot of people in here tonight. So, and all very interested in listening. So this is fantastic. Anyway, we're going to get back to, I'm just kind of focusing on, I hope you guys are, I hope you're enjoying it. It's just mostly about, it's to us, we're kind of just visiting and I'm doing this interview with him and letting him speak. And then, but thank you for coming and visiting with us. Anyway, now back to now.
So this is where the nanoplasma comes in. This is where it's relevant. So you got this Dr. Doofus, as I call her, Dr. Doof something, the hyphenated name. When she sent me home, she had bandaged, and I had assumed she had stitched my chest tube sites, but she hadn't. And she sent me home with them covered only in Band-Aids because she had been awake for 3 days. And when I went home, basically what I had was 2 sucking chest wounds. 2 sucking chest wounds.
That's crazy.
And if you've ever seen a floater, they call them floaters. This is when bodies wash up on the beach and they're all bloated.
Right.
Yeah, that's what happened to me. I looked like the Michelin mummy. And my neck swelled up so much with all this sepsis. This is systemic infection.
Yeah.
My neck swelled up with all this sepsis that when I called the 911, I sounded like a Muppet, and they thought it was a practical joke. I'm like saying, help, I can't breathe, and you know, help, I can't breathe, or something like. And then the guy said, yeah, maybe you should, you know, take, let go of your nose, and stupid shit like this.
Okay.
And I said, no, I'm sorry. And then he says, look, we don't have time for these practical jokes. And he hung up. He hung up, which, by the way, is also illegal.
Right.
And so, but luckily, I'm sorry. But,
oh, no.
Yeah.
Let's tell them about the Presidio and Michael Aquino.
Sure.
Let's tell them about that.
So just to put all that aside for now, just understand that without the nanoplasma, I would not have survived all of this, obviously.
Right.
My genetics and the nanoplasma. Obviously, I can suffer grievous injuries and survive.
Mm-hmm.
So I do want people to understand this. That should be obvious at this point. This is just the tip of the iceberg, what I'm describing. It's a horror story that obviously I could render into a mini-series. So just understand, without the nanoplasma, I wouldn't be here. Among also the genetics that enabled me to survive the nanoplasma, which we'll go into some other time. So when I was liaising with Michael Aquino brought up Dianne Feinstein, who our dear friend Aristides brought up is dead, died on the 29th of September this year.
Yeah,
and I do want people to understand that there was another death that we should get to tonight because it is quite relevant, and that is Frank Borman died yesterday by now. Today, essentially, yesterday by now. And he was the NASA astronaut, the oldest one alive.
Oh, yeah, you sent that to me. I saw that.
Yes, and
Yes.
it's very relevant. We'll get to that later. But what happened was that when it came to Michael Aquino, he had pointed out to me, Douglas, you remember Dianne Feinstein and the Night Stalker. And of course, I was familiar with the Night Stalker. And the reason I was so painfully familiar with the Night Stalker, understand Michael Aquino was U.S. Army Green Berets. I mean, forget everything about John Wayne. That's all Hollywood nonsense. Mm-hmm. Understand that when you think of U.S. Army Green Berets, think of Michael Aquino and think of Master Sergeant Michael Ramirez. Not Richard Ramirez, but Michael Ramirez.
His father?
His uncle.
His uncle.
His uncle. And so Master Sergeant Michael Ramirez had been sentenced to methadone treatments at Letterman Army Medical Center, and I had to keep him at bay in the library from going into the children's room. He was constantly trying to go into the children's room and molest the children. He had a shoebox full of memories that he would share with the adults. He would have shared them with the children had I not prevented him. I'm certain that when other people were on duty, he probably got away with everything he wanted. But when I was on duty, I wasn't going to tolerate that. And so I would draw him aside and distract him by holding conversations with him while I was doing my work. And one time I asked him about the shoebox. He showed it to me. I looked through all the photographs, and these were pictures he had taken of young women he had raped and tortured to death in Vietnam. He would basically cut their breasts off with his bayonet. He would rape them orally. He called it skull fucking while he had a gun to their head, and then blow their brains out at the moment that he ejaculated. This was the kind of monster this individual was. When I asked him, look, you've gotten away with so much. How did you get away with, whatever it was you did? What did you do? I asked him to get sentenced to the methadone treatment. And that's when he said, I blew my wife's brains out. And that's when
Now
I said,
clarify who
most.
this was again.
I'm sorry, honey. What's that?
The person who was doing this, who you're talking to. Clarify.
Oh, Michael Ramirez, the Master Sergeant Michael Ramirez
Yes.
of the U.S. Army Green Berets, the uncle of Richard Ramirez.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah, and so he basically had. What I was wondering was how he got sentenced at all, because I said most of the time Green Berets, these special forces troops, will murder their entire family and they'll just say it's post-traumatic stress disorder and let them go. They'll get off on some psychiatric excuse. But in his case, and by the way, just for people who are doubt of that, we could go into that later. There's different cases where this has happened and soldiers have gotten away with literally murder. When it came to Michael Ramirez, he was sentenced because there was a witness. And I said, who was the witness to you killing your wife? And he said, oh, it was my nephew, Richard Ramirez.
Oh, wow.
And I said, did this bother him? He said, no, he got off on it. He used to take my shoebox full of these pictures, go to the graveyard every night, and jack off to them under the moonlight.
Right.
And
so what you're looking at here is that, again, the emphasis that inside of the environment you were working in, you were coming into contact with these people who were just very extreme, really. To not, and most people would not even fathom this. Do you see what I'm saying? So they might find it shocking. But in this environment, there was a concentration of this type of, and what year about what time, do you remember? I mean, you don't have to be precise.
This had to be around 84, 88, maybe about between 84 and 86. Mm-hmm. Is when so much of this went down.
Okay, and then, and that's interesting. It was during the time of the, and then the Presidio daycare center. A lot of people are no longer even familiar with what the story is and about how it was burned down and about.
Yes. So let's get into that, and I do want people to understand some of the connectivity here, though. When it came to,
it seems it's all connected, isn't it? I mean, it seems.
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
It is. Yeah. Understand that Michael Ramirez is part of what Michael Aquino called his California Little League. And ultimately, Richard Ramirez was part of that California Little League. And by that, what Michael Aquino was referring to was a little league of serial killers. There's serial killers all over the United States, but California had its own special Little League. And it was basically, we also had the Golden State Killer. And just so people understand, they can look up the Golden State Killer history. And he was also a military officer who had served as a police officer and basically got away with murder in what ultimately amounted to very likely hundreds of murders. Though we know scores can be proven, we know that there were many more that have never been traced. All of this is a product of this military environment. These were the people I worked with every day.
Yeah, yes. And then we'll have to try to get into, if possible, if you have the time and everything, and if it works out that way, about who Michael Aquino is, and to tell them about that more, because a lot of people may not know who this is. And then too, the Temple of Set that he was involved with. Not have to go into a great deal of detail, but just explaining, and then why he was a general, colonel, wasn't he a colonel?
Yes. So let me explain that, and also explain to people that when he told me how I got the job, when he was, and we'll get to his history. By the way, Michael Ramirez ultimately died of a heroin overdose, just so people know that. Mm-hmm. When it came to Michael Aquino sharing history with me and the like, one of the things he brought to my attention was Dianne Feinstein. And he said, remember how she was helping Richard Ramirez? And then he pointed out Richard Ramirez worked for me, just like his uncle did. And one of the things he was pointing out was that, you remember Dan White? And I said, of course. And how he killed the mayor? I said, yeah, of course. And, well, that's how Leanne Prifty got fired by Dianne Feinstein, and that's how you got this job. Remember, I had the mayor of San Francisco and the mayor of Castro Street killed so you could work for me.
That's crazy, too. Michael Aquino said that to you. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
When did you first meet him,
You know, I
Like in
first became aware of him when I was 14 with the blood transfusion, as I mentioned. The old man the girl kept referring to, I realized by her description of him that I had seen him in the Presidio a lot. He stood out like a sore thumb because he wore full pancake makeup. He had the horned brow that was clipped so that he would look like the devil himself. And he had the widow's peak. And he had a 666 tattooed on his scalp. So in the cloverleaf formation, like which is what they do in prisons. But altogether, he stood out well enough where you could recognize him. Bear in mind, right outside the Presidio military base, which was 1,400 acres, took up a good part of San Francisco.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yes, yes. Just so people understand it, if you were to hold up your hand where you had like your thumb, your San Francisco would be the fingernail, and the rest of your thumb would be the peninsula on which San Francisco is. Yeah, that would be South San Francisco and the like. And a quarter of that thumbnail would be the Presidio. And this is the most valuable land in the world. And this is like, here we have so much of it going to that military base. And it was there forever. And outside of the Arguello Gate was the Magus Anton Zandor LaVey, the founder of the First Church of Satan.
Yeah.
And so his cousin was in the Army Reserves and was also in the Presidio. So you have this military connection with the Church of Satan right outside the door, so to speak, which Michael Aquino had originally joined. And this was in 1968, just when he was shipping out to Vietnam. He joined the First Church of Satan of Anton Zandor LaVey, who kept a living lion in his own home.
Right.
And so we're talking about extremely unusual people, all the extreme, just to give people an idea of how extreme before I go back to the history.
They'll need the references.
Yeah.
So go ahead
yeah.
now.
Yeah. So people have an idea of how extreme my environment was. We had, of course, for adult soldiers, Playboy magazine, Penthouse magazine coming in every month. Nobody looked at that. Nobody looked at that. I would look at them because I enjoyed full-bodied woman, mature woman. All guys would laugh at me and say, "You like those bleeders," they called them. Bleeders. They said, "You like those bleeders?" And all of them say, "We can't stand any girl that's over 9 years old." This is like the norm. This is like the norm in terms of the soldier that I would be talking to on a daily basis.
They're at the Presidio base, you say?
They're at the Presidio military base, but these were guys who transferred from all over. And of course, the Presidio military base had transfers on a daily level. So you had guys coming in and out. This was the norm in the U.S. military. They go all over the world so they can have sex with children and not be arrested for it. This is why so many men join the military. It's one of the primary reasons. And just so people understand, this was why all the human child trafficking was rife in the U.S. military. And I'll get to the child daycare center because of that. And understand that all of this Aquino played a great role in. So understand that when it comes to the attitude, military attitude toward children, here's a good example. I knew this one son of a bitch named Keith Johansson. And Keith Johansson was in the U.S. Army. And he relayed to me a crime. And when he relayed to me the crime, he says, "Yeah, I was in Panama. When I was stationed in Panama, you know, there was a bunch of these board guys, and we were doing combat practice, and they had a mortar, and a bunch of these kids were playing soccer in the field across the way, you know, because we're holding war games, and we're just setting off mortars because Panama's a small country. Nobody gives a shit. And, you know, we're doing this in what's practice for urban combat." And so they were bored, so they turned the mortar around, they mortared all the kids and killed them all. And I said, "Why didn't you report this?" He said, "Why? They're just niggers." And I said, "Well, technically they're Latin American. Were they black?" "Well, no, but they're not white." And I said, "Well, would you think of reporting it now? You know, there's no time limit or statute on murder." He said, "Are you kidding? I wouldn't risk my retirement." So this is the attitude. You've got all these military men with a code of silence, not reporting each other because they're all on retirement, and they're not going to risk that to report each other. But they all do shit like this in general.
And a lot of these, where are they? Okay, and then the Satanism in the military itself.
Yes. Yes. And this started with the fact that it's not your father's military. It started with the end of the draft. Basically, when you had a draft, then you had all kinds of men going into the military. At the same time, during Vietnam, you had an incredible frag rate for officers, meaning men were killing their own officers. Men were attacking their own officers. And I had to deal with the records of this. And just so people understand the enormity of what I'm talking about, the amount of records that were tabulated concerning officers attacked by their own men, fragged, was 20,000. The Vietnam War was the most dangerous war in human history to be an officer. Soldiers did not want to obey their officers.
So they had like a mutiny thing. They would kill them. Yeah, I see.
Yes, this was quite regular, and ultimately it was one of the factors in the war ending when Vietnam was, well, when Nixon Vietnamized Vietnam in 1973, which was 2 years before the fall of Saigon. When he Vietnamized it, he was basically making a virtue of necessity because commanders were given the orders for advance and entire battalions simply were not advancing. So at that point, Nixon said, we're just going to Vietnamize the war. You can't fight a war if the troops aren't going to fight. So I could go into this for hours, but the point is with Aquino, Michael Aquino entered at a time amidst all this fragging, and the way he would keep the troops at bay would be, one of the ways was through fear. Understand that when you're in military environments, you're essentially in a prison environment. And when you're in prison, how do prisons, environments, what happens in them? You get ethnic gangs. You get ethnic enclaving. So if you look at Vietnam, everybody should be aware by now, Vietnam was an ethnic gang military where blacks were with Bloods and whites were flying the Confederate flag.
Right.
This is all true.
Yeah.
So, just so people understand, the largest prison race riots in American history took place in Vietnam at Long Binh Jail, LBJ. So this is how serious the situation was. One of the big race riots took place on an American aircraft carrier.
That's pretty amazing, really.
It is. It is. These were blacks and whites killing each other with knives and forks. So you've got a prison environment, and so Michael Aquino was like a prisoner. He had the 666 cloverleaf tattooed on his scalp, and he already had that fear impression. You see, in prison, they intimidate each other through the occult. They get the 666 cloverleaf tattoo, they get occult symbols, and they basically threaten each other with as much the mojo as they do with violence. Like, I'll put the curse on you. I mean, these guys got nothing to do, so they spend all day killing each other, fucking each other, cursing each other. And believe me, sometimes those spells work.
Oh, you know what? We will get to, if anybody ever has any, would you answer some questions later off of the chat?
Sure, I'd be willing to.
But not right now, but after a while.
So when it comes to Michael Aquino, understand that here was a guy who was a lieutenant colonel at the time that I was working with him. He retired as what we call a full bird colonel, but he was not a general in the U.S. military. He laterally transferred to intelligence because he could no longer advance in the military because I had effectively ruined his career. He ultimately joined the National Security Agency and became a deputy director, what is called in the bureaucracy a super grade, which means he was the civilian equivalent of a general. Right. So he ultimately retired with the civilian equivalent status of a general, but it was within NSA intelligence, which of course controls communications in our country, which is how they attacked our dear Jennifer Hawkins tonight. That's NSA. They control our communications. That's what they're responsible for. So when it comes to when we're attacked by NSA, these are cultists of Aquino still embedded in the NSA. So when it comes to Michael Aquino and his background, understand that you had a man who, during the time of all this enormous fragging, was then taking advantage of it by basically replacing all of these slaughtered officers with Satanists, members of his cabal.
Yeah, this is for me like I really want to to hear this. Please, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but to tell you that, just so you would go in as much detail as possible.
Yes, yes.
But,
Just so people understand, Michael Aquino was someone who, this is the legend. This is the legend. And I'll tell you the truth. The legend is Michael Aquino was like traipsing around and saw the theater with Rosemary's Baby.
Mhm.
And then he went to see it, and it was the opening. And the man who had acted as the occult advisor, consultant for the movie was Anton Szandor LaVey,
Right.
and he encountered him there and then joined the First Church of Satan. And that was supposed to be his introduction to Satanism.
Now, people may
It's-
not know that. Repeat that again.
So, Magus Anton Szandor LaVey, the founder of the First Church of Satan, was the occult consultant for Rosemary's Baby, the movie. And what happened was that he was at the opening night in San Francisco, and the Marquis Theater basically was advertising that fact. And Aquino, supposedly, according to urban legend, was traipsing around innocently, then winds up saying, "Oh, I think I'll see a movie," winds up meeting Anton Szandor LaVey and converting to the First Church of Satan. None of this is exactly as it seems. Basically, what happened was that Michael Aquino was ordered to infiltrate the church, and he was ordered by the U.S. Army because he was a member of the John F. Kennedy Special Forces Psychological Warfare Operations
Right.
School,
Yeah.
a graduate thereof. And they said that, hey, Anton Szandor LaVey has got all kinds of occult secrets that could help us. So we want you to infiltrate his church. Now, he was already a member of a different cult, Aquino, before he joined the Church of Satan. He was a member of this military cult known as the Kings of Edom. And they also called themselves the Tribe. You can look that up and you'll find some references to it. You'll probably hear it mentioned in The Men Who Stare at Goats, that movie starring George Clooney. Now, all of this is important. I'll get to that. When it comes to Michael Aquino, he was assigned by the U.S. military to infiltrate the Church of Satan and ultimately take it over. Instead, what happened was he wound up over the years in a magical battle and a battle of wits and willpower, ego with Szandor LaVey, who ultimately kicked him out, and he formed his own church, the Temple of Set, schismatic. Now, there's a practical reason for this. Anton Szandor LaVey was preaching a atheistic Satanism. As he himself said, it was Ayn Rand with magical ritual attached. So when it came to what needs to be understood here was that when it came to Mr. Karl Marx, his real birth name was Rabbi, and by the way, that's also a name. It's not just a religious position or a clerical
Yeah,
profession.
he'd be like
It's also-
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so his name was Rabbi Mordecai Levy. That was the real name of Karl Marx. Karl Marx developed godless communism, and this had an enormous murderous impact on the world. Now, one of the refugees from communism was Ayn Rand. She was a Russian Jewess, and she developed a godless capitalism called her objectivism. And Ayn Rand's philosophy was then taken by, and by the way, for anyone who doesn't know what Ayn Rand is all about, Ayn Rand wrote in her private journals about how much she admired a particular serial killer who had taken a young girl out and spent weeks torturing her to death. And she said, this man should be president. That's Ayn Rand. And so Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism was taken by Magus Anton Szandor LaVey, who was also ethnically Jewish, and he took it straight to godless atheism. In other words, there is no Satan, but we have magical ritual and a belief in your ego. You are Satan, and this was his claim, was that you could empower yourself to be Satan on earth, that you Satan is within you because you are Satan. And this is the philosophy of Anton Szandor LaVey. But Anton Szandor LaVey was also
That's
he hated
interesting
churches.
too.
Yeah.
That how do you think that tie? Well, we don't have to go into it, but do you think that I think that could tie into how Charles Manson and the Process Church, they talked about that they are Lucifer Jesus, you know,
Yes.
all of it together.
Absolutely. It's all the
Excuse me.
same.
Yeah.
It's all part of this network. Absolutely. Absolutely. For those of you who don't know, Maury Terry wrote the book The Ultimate Evil. That's the title of his book. And Maury Terry felt so devastated by his conclusion that this was one giant satanic cult running America, enabled by the police, that he ultimately drank himself to death. And he's right. And I'll tell you how right now. Is basically, this is how it works when when I started hemorrhaging the facts about human child trafficking at the Presidio, and understand that the U.S. Army alone, at that time in history, with military bases in West Germany, in Panama, in Okinawa, all over the world, they had daycare centers all over the world for the military families. And at that time, the U.S. Army alone was taking care on a daily basis of 100,000 children a day, on a daily basis. And so then what happened was, when I was exposing all this information, the FBI became involved. The ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, became involved, investigating the fires, which we'll get into, when people were burning down the daycare center of children. And later the military responded by burning down the record center so that the parents would have no evidence that their children had been trafficked. All of this was one building after another burning down. They brought the ATF in to investigate it, and the ATF said it's definitely arson. And
what's interesting is people can actually look this. It's in the news. I mean, it's in the old papers. It did happen. It's not. All of this actually is verifiable and can be sourced through the not the finer details Mr. Dietrich's revealing, but the events themselves. You can find they are sourced. Presidio did burn down. The records department was burnt down. These children did. There was trafficking going on. What we're saying, like what he's saying about with all of this, about the stories with Michael Aquino himself, the position he held, that he created the Temple of Set, that he was, and that there was a slow switchover of Satanism in the military, as many of these other officers would go missing or would leave, be forced out in a way. Because it seems like there was some of that too, also, that there was a forcing
absolutely.
out of the old guard, so to speak, and bringing in a new guard,
Absolutely. And here's a great example of it. When I was working at the Presidio military base, and what I was exposing, I also was exposing what was going on at other military bases. Now, one of the things that I was doing as a liaison for Michael Aquino was covering for him. I was also exposing him. But in a sense, I covered for him in such a way he didn't expect I was exposing him. So I had to, like a spy, this is what an espionage agent does, or an undercover cop does. If you're an undercover cop or a spy, there's certain things you're going to be doing that are criminal in order to expedite your ultimate objective for your side. In order to help the public, the only thing I could do was cooperate in a number of criminal areas, such as covering up for Aquino whenever he was on base when he wasn't supposed to be. There were times when he would enter the base through the tunnel system. For those of you who don't know, there were ancient tunnels dug by the slaves. These were the Indians that were enslaved by the conquistadors, who had built the Presidio. Its original name was El Presidio Real de San Francisco, and it was built during the days of the conquistadors. The Officers Club building is established in 1776. It's as old as any building on the East Coast.
So I would assume that even the location itself has significance for them for some reason, and not just that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And those tunnels were expanded during the Cold War, where they added underground bunkers. The controls for the Nike Zeus anti-ballistic missile system, if someone were to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile at San Francisco, theoretically they could have launched missiles that would have emerged from across the bay, controlled through Presidio, that would have taken out that missile incoming, an anti-missile system. So this was called Nike, Zeus, Hercules, the entire system of missiles. So
Fantastic,
these were,
really. You
yeah,
know, the name.
lead line.
Go ahead.
Yeah, these were all lead-lined bunkers. And so many of these, along with the old cannon bunkers for firing at ships that might come into port, all of these bunkers became interconnected with tunnels, and this is where they kept hundreds of children. Michael Aquino used to enter the base secretly through those tunnels. At times he was supposed to be in West Virginia or at other parts of the country. At times like that, I never exposed him. I simply said Michael Aquino was not present on base during that time, according to our papers. According to, he did not enter through the gate, therefore, technically, he never entered the base. But he was on base in the tunnels. So this is all true. And when it came to the other factor here, he was in West Virginia, and of course, that's also where, many times, and that's also West Point. And so people need to understand that the child daycare center in West Point at that time was building number 666. And so I'll keep talking while so in building number
I just have
6,
to check on I have my pups.
Do you want me to take a break, or do you want me to keep talking?
Do you want to take a break for a minute?
Sure, I'll take a break. I'll just take a breather.
Let's take a break for a minute if you like, and I'll be back in just a little bit.
Take your time, darling. I'll keep bandwidth burning. I'll keep bandwidth. I'll just talk casually. So, yeah, I want everyone to understand what a wonderful young lady Jennifer is. She works hard. You know, she's working tomorrow. So God knows I hate to keep her, you know, up so late into the night. I mean, it's 11 p.m. here, but it's like 3 hours ahead where she's at. No, 2 hours ahead. 11 to 12 to 1. It's 1 a.m. where she's at. And then again, she's on a show at times fairly late and seems to be able to handle it. So not feeling, you know, too guilty about it, but guilty enough. And yeah, all that being said, we are... you know, keeping this going, and I could check into the chat, but, you know, that would require my looking at what's on her channel. Let me take a look. You know, I'm more used to doing this than she is. Yeah, and so, of course, you wouldn't think it, look at what I'm doing now. What am I doing? First thing I'm going to do is close my own OBS, and then we're going to take a look at her channel. Let's go to her channel. And there's a question for you in the YouTube chat. Thank you, Nemo. Let's take a look at live, make certain the voice is off, and I can see my own head moving around. And let's take a look here. Troubled Minds is with us. Those are the radio people, or that might be her. Thomas Payne says, "Is this the Douglas Dietrich on the YouTube?"
Hello,
yes.
Can you hear me okay, Mr. Dietrich?
Yeah.
Okay, I do want to say, okay, I want to say that I am so appreciative of everyone's comments and ideas in the chat, and I will also say that Mr. Dietrich is my guest, and so I'm so grateful for this interview. So should any of you not like this information, or in a closed-minded way not take it seriously in the realm of respect of the search for truth, you know where the door is. And I'll remind you that only in searching will you find the truth. So remember that. Mr. Dietrich is my guest, and this is my house here in the situation, and no one needs keyboard warriors who can't be respectful to information, even if it doesn't jive with the wishes of everyone's ideas of truth. Be a truth seeker. So go to those places, hear those stories, or don't bother. And that said, thank all of you. I thank all of you for being here. And let's get back to actually interviewing Mr. Dietrich and hearing what he has to say, because that's the reason we're here. And take the information in. Go cross-check this information if you like. And I just wanted to say that because I know that some of this stuff some people may have an opinion. And it's like, well, right now it's about hearing Mr. Dietrich's account. and the information that he has to say. And if you don't want to sit and hear it, then just go. And or if you can handle it to sit and listen to it, then do that. But this is Mr. Dietrich, Mr. Douglas Dietrich, the former research librarian for the Department of Defense, an author, a public informant, and so very knowledgeable. And there, at the time, while Satanism was coming into the military, and when it was really having an impact on the policies that were coming about, and this is not, there's no bias here, it's just information. And that's important.
Yes. Bless you. Very well said. Very well said. And important to remember that if it sounds like I'm going off on a tangent at times, ultimately, as Jennifer observes, it really is all connected. So understand we were talking about West Point, and the importance there was at the time, Michael Aquino was in West Virginia, and the sheriffs were investigating him there in West Virginia as well, where they found out in investigating the local satanic coven that all the members were U.S. Army officers who were members of the Temple of Set. So he was so powerful, so influential, that he ultimately was asked to write the chaplain's handbook. So understand that the U.S. military, all branches of service, this means Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, as well as Army, all their chaplains were handling a chaplain's handbook that was written by Michael Aquino. And he was put in charge of writing the chaplain's handbook because he integrated into that handbook.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote the chaplain's handbook. And this is huge. The kind of impact that he. Yeah. Sorry about that. I had to go.
Yeah.
Hang on. Let me.
Yeah. And by the way, if you want to come back on camera, you're welcome.
Yeah, I just had to. I had to go check on this and that, and then. But you know, I understand people may be like, well, I don't agree with it. Doesn't matter if you agree with it. Right now, it's important to just listen. And again, I do appreciate the ideas and that you people are, you know, enjoying this as much as I am. And I hope that you will have the patience to hear perspectives, firsthand account perspectives, and the way. And please continue, Mr. Dietrich. So this man was. Michael Aquino was playing a huge role. He was well respected. He had a great deal of influence. Go ahead.
Let me give you an example of how we were talking about the officers pushed out. We're talking about the chaplain's handbook, his influence on law. So we're going to get into all of this. So when it comes to the chaplain's handbook, to follow up on this, he wrote the chaplain's handbook. He introduced the religions of Wicca and Satanism into the chaplain's handbook, and he said that they need to be recognized as the religions that the military abides by, just as valid as Christianity or Judaism. This was at a time before Muslim or Islam or Buddhism was really integrated into the military. You basically had Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, basically also Mormons, lots of Mormons. But he was also introducing Wiccanism and Satanism. And he was pointing out that no matter what chaplains are on site, whether Mormon or a Jewish rabbi, a Catholic priest, or a Protestant deacon, when the satanic chaplain shows up, everybody else has to step back and stand down. That's because the unofficial religion of the military is Satanism. For those of you who doubt, there's a documentary you can find on YouTube titled The Dark Side of Aldura. Aldura is spelled A-L space D-O-U-R-A. And The Dark Side of Aldura is about a U.S. Army Ranger. These are another elite of the U.S. Army, like the Green Berets. They used to be known as the Black Berets. And they would be the scouts. The Rangers would be reconnaissance and force, meaning these were like battlefield assassins. And there was this one young U.S. Army Ranger served in the Gulf War. We're well after Michael Aquino. This was a guy named I forget his name exactly, but if you review The Dark Side of Aldura, you run across his tragic story. Needham. His surname was Needham. He took photographs of what the satanic chaplains in the U.S. Army were doing. He took photographs of the fact that they were cracking open young boys' skulls, only young boys. They didn't want the girls because they didn't want the estrogen. They were cracking open young boys' skulls and then taking out their brains to pass around for the troops to eat. This was the satanic consecration. And he was taking photographs of this, photographic evidence, and a photographic evidence of their skinning men alive, scalping their faces off. All of this is
that's interesting, when you think about that, scalping the faces off. With the incident in Peru recently, that is fascinating.
Yes.
I wonder if there's something. I wonder if there's something to that. There might not be. I don't know. That's just interesting. But anyway, go ahead.
It's an important point. Well taken. And understand that John Needham was tortured mercilessly. When he reported to his officers, they basically targeted him as a traitor. They locked him up in a hot locker box in the desert sun until all his skin burned off. By the time they sent him home, he was so beaten and so crazed that his girlfriend, who was a nurse, had to leave him. And she said that he tried to kill her. And of course, he picked up an ethnic girlfriend who had essentially no rights because she couldn't communicate in English very well. And he killed her instead. And of course, like most troops, as I said, the judge just let him go. Just said, oh, well, he's a soldier. He's got post-traumatic stress disorder. He's not responsible for his actions. Just turned him into the care of his father. And but then he wound up dying anyway. His dad was taking him for a walk along the beach like a dog. And it's like somebody pressed a remote switch. He just shut down. His heart stopped. He dropped and he died. Very occult-like. Now, in terms of this John Needham, the subject, the U.S. Army Ranger who's the subject of The Dark Side of Aldura, it opens up with Dick Cheney saying, "We must go to the dark side. We must go to the dark side." Literally, him saying that. And all of this goes to show where your military is at now, what the satanic chaplaincy is doing. This is what it was doing in Iraq when John Needham was there. This is not something that is I'm indulging myself in as some kind of fantasy. And to give you an example how officers were pushed out who were not with the program, at West Point, at the time that I was dealing with all of this, the child daycare center building in West Point, where they train your Army officers, this was building number 666. And at building number 666, the children were coming home, and as I said, a military doctor forswears the Hippocratic Oath. He does not swear by it, he forswears it, because he needs to do damage as well as save lives. He needs to be able to develop biological weapons, and needs to be able to hurt the enemy as well as help his own troops. Mm-hmm. So military doctors are different. And at the same time, the kids who were coming home from building number 666 at West Point, most of their parents were U.S. Army doctors and nurses. That meant they were officers. These were officers' children. And they were coming home with chlamydia, every STD you can imagine, venereal diseases, and they were coming home with grievous injuries to their anuses and vaginas. People had shoved broken bottles up their asses or their vaginal orifices, and baseball bats, stretching their youthful genitalia all out of proportion. And of course the doctors knew exactly what had happened. And they said, somebody has raped our child with a broken bottle, with a baseball bat. And they were simply told, we'll bring in an investigator. And who came in? Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani was brought in to investigate. And Rudy Giuliani said, it's cool. It's cool. He said, everything happening here, the kids did to themselves. He said, all these children broke bottles and shoved it up their own cunts and asses because they want attention.
Oh, Mr. Dietrich, we have to really try to be careful with language.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
Oh,
Do you understand, of course, the background, what I was dealing with on a daily basis, of course.
go right ahead. Go right along.
Yes. And so here's Rudy Giuliani saying it's all the kids' fault. And he said they're just trying to frame a bunch of innocent people on site. And but it's really their parents are programming them to do this, and their parents have to be removed from the military. So the parents quit en masse. Many U.S. Army doctors quit then, many nurses quit then. And this was how John Henry Hagman got more and more control of the entire situation.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about all of this going down as one example. Another example is when Michael Aquino was brought on trial. With everything that I was exposing, he was finally brought to bear by a woman he considered his nemesis. She was Sandy Gallant. She was this blonde-haired, blue-eyed Nordic Aryan female who was an inspector in the San Francisco Police Department. I worked with her. She became famous because she had warned of a body found in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. A headless body was found in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, and in place of the human head was a chicken head. And everybody thought, what's this crime? She said, it's voodoo. This is Valjo Houduns. And this is a ceremony in which the Bokor, the black magician, will come back and try to reanimate this body as a zombie. She said, put it under armed guard. Everybody said, you're crazy, you're stupid. They laughed at her, but they put in armed guard. Private security man, they didn't even bother with putting a real cop guarding the body. Well, that private security guard died defending that body. A whole gang of people broke into the coroner's office that night and tried to take the body. He fought them off and paid for it with his life, but they never got the body. And so what happened was she had prevented the reanimation of a zombie. She became an expert consultant in occult crime after that. When Sandy Gallant began to investigate Michael Aquino because of what I was informing her about, she actually published a police manual on occult crime. This, of course, was patented in ring binder form because police manuals, field manuals, are all ring binders, so they can take in and insert new kinds of instructions for the field every time new laws are imposed, every time new litigation is become the law of the land, and they have to know what to enforce. Other times laws are revoked, and then they take the
it's in a ring binder
and
because they're constantly adjusting it.
changing.
Yes.
Yeah, so this ring binder manual on occult crime, if you look for it on the internet, you'll find it, but you'll find it censored heavily. When she did this, people were going to seriously, all over the United States, departments at every level were seriously going to start investigating occult crime. And Michael Aquino said, I've got to stop this. Well, he used a word I'm not going to use. And so he sent his running dog, Lieutenant Colonel James Channon, who was to retire as a full bird colonel. Now, James Channon was the man who was in charge of the 1st Earth Battalion. The 1st Earth Battalion declared themselves to be satanic warrior monks, and they had their own academy of dark Jedi that they called themselves. They hadn't come up with the term Sith yet, and they called themselves the Satan's Crusaders. And their headquarters was in New Mexico, and was paid for by U.S. tax dollars. And this man, unlike Aquino, because Aquino was able to appear on Oprah Winfrey, he was able to appear on Geraldo Rivera and other shows only in his satanic regalia. He couldn't appear in full uniform because the U.S. Army told him, look, you're too controversial. We can't have you appearing in a military uniform. But James Channon could. And James Channon went all over the United States, and he went to all of the federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI, the big constabularies like Los Angeles Police Department, and everywhere he went, he said, look, if a Roman Catholic immigrant robs a bank and they drop a saint's medallion on the floor of that bank, Does that implicate the Catholic Church in that bank robbery? And of course, all the cops said, no, of course not. Of course not. That's ridiculous. So then he said, that means that when you find a headless body in a pentagram drawn in human blood, that cannot implicate the Satanic Church. And all the cops said, fine, let's work for us. So after that, they tore all of the manual out of the ring binders.
You see how that's hugely important. I mean, the logic, I mean, on paper, yeah. I mean, of course, that would make... But from that point on, that would insinuate that these incidences, if they did have any hint of Satanism involvement, or that this was a ritual of some kind, that would be left out of it conveniently. Those little aspects is what you're saying.
All of it.
Yeah.
Worse than that, what the cops do is when they find a headless body inside of a pentagram drawn in human blood, they just hose it away. In other words, they enable the crime. This has given the Satanists a 007 license to kill. Now, if you don't believe me, let me drive the point home. When I exposed everything I did, and we took down...
Who was the man who said that? One more,
Sure.
Just to make sure everybody knows.
James Channon. James Channon. And just so people know, James Channon had liver spots under his eyes, big bags under his eyes that looked like beef liver. His breath stank because you could smell his decaying liver from all the alcohol he drank. Mm-hmm. And he was portrayed in the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats by George Clooney.
That's
George
incredible.
Clooney
That's
played
incredible.
this guy up as a sex bomb.
Yeah.
And so this is the man who in the Men Who Stare at Goats is supposed to be the good guy. That's James Channon. The guy went all over the place and said, cops, you got to stop pursuing the churches. That's religious persecution. That's against the constitutional law because we have freedom of religion. Mm-hmm. All the way up to human sacrifice. And whoever doesn't believe me, dig this. So when I basically was a student at John O'Connell Vocational Institute, I majored in commercial illustration. Now, because I graduated early due to a GED and went to City College early because I was, nanoplasma brilliant, I basically had a talent for illustration that enabled me to make money. Now, the big industry in San Francisco was pornography. It was the adult entertainment capital of the world aside from Paris. And as a result, I was illustrating pornography before I was of age to purchase it. Mm-hmm. So when I was illustrating pornography, a lot of references I were used were photographs, because this is how professional illustration is done. You use photographic reference. Mm-hmm. And the man who kept a lot of photographic references of naked children on site, the John O'Connell Vocational Institute, was a man named Gary Willard Hambright. He was the manager of the child daycare center at the Presidio military base.
Yeah.
And Gary Willard Hambright was my commercial illustration instructor. So you had a guy who had all this child porn. He kept on site San Francisco Unified School District property. That was ultimately how I got him taken down. Mm-hmm. You see, everything that was going on at the Presidio, when I was pointing out child trafficking, child rape, everything that the FBI was trying to investigate there or other departments, they were all thrown off by the U.S. Army.
Right.
The U.S. Army. Go on.
Didn't you help Alex Jones to get into Bohemian Grove?
Yes. That was at Sonoma State University. What happened was that I had been dispatched by the U.S. Department of Defense as a spy to Sonoma State University because Sonoma State University, for whatever reason, Sonoma State University was originally built as a woman's prison. And when the locals said, we don't want a woman's prison here, they said, fine, we'll make it a university. And so then what happened was, after they made it a university, and believe me, it felt like a prison, what happened was that for some reason, John McLaughlin, Ted Koppel, and a number of big-time names in journalism funded Project Censored. And Project Censored was journalism majors investigating the most censored stories in the United States and the world. And so somehow they investigated HAARP and had found out details about HAARP they weren't supposed to know. So they sent me into Sonoma State University for a year to try and find out how Project Censored was getting such information. So while I was at Sonoma State University, Ron Johnson and Alex Jones, our quote-unquote journalists, they show up and they say, hey, we're going up to Bohemian Grove to, you know, the kids who were supposed to be members of Project Censored. And nobody wanted to go. And so I said, I'll go. And so I was driven up there with them. And when we get to this Bohemian Grove, these idiots, Ron Johnson, who wrote the book The Men Who Stare at Goats, and Alex Jones, who needs no introduction, but filters in later. Basically, you've got these two goobers who are like running around sports jackets, and it's not like they got any pliers to cut through razor wire or something like that, or gloves to protect them from electric shock from the fencing. So I said, why don't you guys stop running around? And I went to the gate, and I said, tell Michael Aquino that I'm here with a couple of guys who want to come into Bohemian Grove, a couple of journalists. And then the guard went to find Michael Aquino. Michael Aquino comes to the gate and says, oh, Doug. He says, oh, let him in. And both Ron Johnson and Alex Jones were just like zombies. They just saw him. And it's like, he treated them like a couple of mindless robots. He only talked to me. These guys to him just didn't exist. These were like, you know, just a couple of fools. But he knew them.
Yeah.
He knew who they were. And
we're going to have to continue this more, but we're not leaving yet.
No, not at all.
I wanted to ask you if we could, maybe we should take some questions. I will look at them myself, and but do you want to take any questions from the chat?
Oh, we can in a moment, but I do want to make some points clear first.
Okay.
One of the points clear that I want to make is think about what I said about James Channon. And also, it's important to remember that when Sandy Gallant, that San Francisco Police Department inspector, who could have quit and become a career occult consultant, she personally wanted to take Aquino down. The only person she could take down initially was Gary Willard Hambright, because I was able to inform her, look, this guy's keeping child porn on site San Francisco Unified School District property. That's how the San Francisco Police Department was able to take him down off the base. You see, otherwise, if he were on base, he was protected by the Army. Every time the FBI or other government agencies were trying to bust somebody on the base, the U.S. Army would cry jurisdiction and say, we've got our own criminal investigative division, the CID. And therefore, we say that you don't have jurisdiction to arrest this person or even to question them. So they couldn't get anything done on the base. And the only way to get one of them taken down was to get him off the base. Because I was able to prove that he had child porn on site the school. And the reason he did so was because he didn't have a home. He was homeless. He effectively lived in a church because he was an ordained Baptist minister without a pulpit. So he was given a home in a church. But other than that, he didn't have a home. So he couldn't keep his child porn at that particular church. He kept it at school, where all the other teachers, who were all male, almost exclusively, were perusing it. So when I was able to get him busted because he was not on the base, this is what took a member of the human child trafficking ring down. Understand that all the children who reported Aquino, thanks to my giving them the courage to do so, telling them to tell the authorities, the FBI would take these children and the FBI would take them on rides through San Francisco. Understand that San Francisco is a city of hills. And this is why they filmed car chases in San Francisco. Everything from Bullet, starring Steve McQueen, to The Rock with Sean Connery and Nicolas Cage. All of this is filmed in San Francisco. Hollywood comes here to film its car chases. So you can confuse people easily by taking them on a San Francisco ride. And what the FBI would do is they'd take all these kids on a ride all the way around San Francisco and then take them by Aquino's house. And they all pointed to Aquino's house and said, that's the house in which they tortured us, raped us. And they would report that it has an all-black living room. Everything inside is painted black. And they were taken to a torture chamber where no one could ever hear them scream. No matter how loud they screamed, nobody could hear them. And so it was Michael Aquino who was identified. They said he was dressed as a woman. Gary Willard Hambright, the man I got taken down, was dressed as a woman. And the wife Lilith was dressed as a man. Now, when the children reported all this, eventually Inspector Glenn Pamfloff raided Aquino's home on Leavenworth Street, just walking distance from my own home.
Why was that, do you think? Why was that?
That they were cross-dressed?
Was it to confuse, like, so the kids wouldn't be able to identify them so easily? Or what do you think it was?
It was one of the factors. The other factor was that it's an inversion ritual. It's an inversion ritual where they're simply exchanging roles. Everybody was forced to call Gary Willard Hambright Mr. Gary. They called Michael Aquino Mikey. Lilith was called Lily, I believe. But when the kids described all this, and then when Inspector Glenn Pamfloff raided Aquino's home, everything the kids said was true. And he said they discovered the dungeon was soundproofed, and it had blood all over the walls. And they would force the kids to write their own names in their own fecal matter on the walls. So their names were dried fecal matter all over the walls of this soundproofed dungeon.
Why do you think, why were they doing this?
Because it would degrade the children, just like the fact that they had a crucifix on the roof. This is when the police officer, Glenn Pamfloff, broke down crying when he was talking to me, because obviously I was giving him a lot of information. And I said, what's so disturbing to you about the cross in the roof? And he said, because Aquino would point to it and tell the kids, see, God's looking down at you, and he wants us to do what we're doing. That's why he's not helping you. And all the kids came to.
What would they do with these children, do you think? What the point of degrading them and getting to this point, but then they
sexually assaulting them, programming them to abuse other people, because the kids grew up in a world where there was no justice. Here's how. You see, when Sandy Gallant finally got Aquino on trial, well, with Gary Willard Hambright, I want people to know this about him.
I just want to add really quickly. I have heard of this in several different SRA, conversations.
Satanic ritual abuse.
Yes. That they will oftentimes do these things, and they will say, do you see how God isn't flashing out of the sky and saving you? And there's this type, it's something that it weighs very heavily on the psyche of these children.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. They feel abandoned by God. Mm-hmm. And they become Satanists as a result, because God is not there for them, but Satan's everywhere. Mm-hmm. So when it came to Sandy Gallant and, Gary Willard Hambright, when he was put on trial, he was federally indicted for sexually assaulting 14 children, all of them under 4 years of age. Mm-hmm. He would have been indicted for hundreds more if he hadn't died of AIDS while he was on trial. And it turned out he had infected, along with many other assailants, 1,000 kids with AIDS at the Presidio military base.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
They all died. 500 children. That's why the families all got together before the U.S. Army transferred them to East Germany and Korea and Okinawa and all over to the four edges of the earth. They all got together and burned the child daycare center to the ground. Then they demanded the records, and that's when the U.S. Army burned the record center to the ground. All of this happened within a span of months. During that time, Gary Willard Hambright died of AIDS, and these parents knew their children were going to die next. And you couldn't sue the U.S. Army in those days. And in terms of the internet, there was no internet, nothing to speak of per se, so they couldn't get their story out. When it came to the trial, when Sandy Gallant finally brought Michael Aquino on trial, he came into the court in full uniform, and he had the full might of the U.S. Army behind him. And he said, I'm a member of the World Affairs Council. I have both national security clearances and international security clearances, and I'm not obligated to tell you anything. And he said, beyond that, I want you to change your laws so that you never bother me or any Satanist again. And so what California did was they said, okay, any child under the age of 18, their testimony is not allowed in a court of law. So think about what I just said. California's got one of the largest economies in the world, one of the largest populations in the world, and it's legal in California to rape a child, to kill a child, and if the child survives your murder attempt, if the child survives your rape attempt, if the child survives as your sex slave, your prisoner escapes, all their testimony, if they're under 18 years of age, is dismissed. That's a legal fact in the state of California because of Michael Aquino. If you don't believe the Satanists run America now through your military junta, you're in complete denial. You're suffering cognitive dissonance. So with that, we'll turn towards some questions. And, whatever Jennifer Hawkins feels is acceptable when she returns. In the meantime, I will express the fact that I appreciate being here. I didn't personally see anything particularly negative in the chat, but I didn't really look. And so I'm certain that our gang stalkers have followed us here, and I'm so glad that Jennifer stands up to them. She's one of a kind. There's only a few people in the world willing to do that, and the fact that she rebounded so readily after that assault at the beginning of our interview tonight. She's made of strong stuff. A great girl. I'll wait till she gets back. So let's see what Nemo is relaying a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
go on.
sorry. No, we
No
should.
worries.
I think it'd be good to take some questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's look. Now, I don't know if anybody has any questions, but if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask Mr. Dietrich, you'll want to put them in all caps, please. And we'll start in order now. The last message I see right now is from Thomas Payne. It says, yes, it is. And Jay Milner. Hey, Jay. How are you? Says, fantastic job. Great guest. So if any of you guys have any questions for Mr. Dietrich, go right ahead now. You can post them in all caps, and I'll try to catch them, and we'll see.
By the way, Nemo in Australia says that he saw a question in the chat earlier. He's relaying it now.
Awesome. Go ahead.
Yeah, apparently what it says is, I'm going to try and access it. There's a question from YouTube chat. He says, who of these kids escaped these horrors to grow up and become whistleblowers? Any books? Yeah, David Schurter, a good example of it. And what happened was that David Schurter, his name is spelled Schurter, first name David. And David Schurter was an individual who was taken into the tunnels, kept as a sex slave of Michael Aquino. For a while was one of Aquino's favorites. And he wrote a book called The Rabbit Hole. So there you have that, David Schurter and The Rabbit Hole. I never read it. I was told by yeah.
Go right ahead. I saw now that
Mike. Oh, please relay it. Yeah.
Mike says his question got blocked. Repost it, Mike. And then YY says she has 2 questions. Mm-hmm. So when you get finished with that, I'll answer these 2 things. Wait.
Sure.
Do you plan? Okay, so YY, most recent question I see is, Mr. Dietrich, do you plan to document all these facts into a book? He has written some books. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, we're writing another book, but I do recommend everyone read the Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II. You can also read Vampirology. That will give you the Soviet side of certain things going on in World War II. We'll get more into the history with a revision and expansion. But I do want people to understand that it's a good overview of the Soviet perspective on vampire physiology. When it comes to the history of World War II, on the American side in particular, read the Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II, and you'll get a lot of details about your history to put things in further context. But we are now working on another book, which we're going to try and get out as soon as possible, which covers a lot of the occult aspects of this. Much
yeah,
of what,
I'm going. Yeah, we're gonna revisit this, and I'm gonna post Mr. Dietrich's books
Oh, thank you.
in the description. You'll have to come back and check it because I have to. We had to drop the first stream, and I had to re-upload a new one. I didn't have time to put all of the details into the description, but when I do, I'll put links to his website, links to his YouTube channel, and then the books that he would like me to post on there as well. I will do so. He'll send it to me in a Skype message. I see here too, looking at this, Mike said it's Troubled Minds. That's Mr. Strange. He says, according to Aquino's account, at Midsummer 1975, Satan appeared and revealed that he wanted to be known by his true name, Set, which had been the name used by his worshippers in ancient Egypt.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. As a matter of fact, just to give people an idea of how Michael Aquino had impressed the military high command in the early days of Vietnam, well, basically at the height of the war, 1968, the Americans were sending helicopters out with stereo systems. You actually see this in the movie Apocalypse Now, but it's portrayed almost like the indulgence of a lone commander. In reality, you had entire units of helicopters dedicated to this task where they would play supernatural noises, the sound of ghosts, so to speak, to terrorize the Viet Cong at night. Of course, the helicopters are big, they make a lot of noise, and they have to come in close for you to hear music from their stereo system. So it's literally a rule of thumb that once a helicopter is larger than your thumb in your vision, you can take it down with a rocket-propelled grenade. So the Americans were losing a lot of helicopters and expensive stereo equipment, and as well as the crews. And so they asked Michael Aquino, what's your solution to this problem? And he basically went into a state of communion and channeled any number of archdemons and channeled the Diabolicon. He wrote this book in a state of automatic writing, meaning that he was in a trance the whole time he wrote the book. And the Diabolicon, you'll see bits of it published. You won't find a full edition. The full edition was actually kept at the Presidio military base under lock and key. It was maintained in a refrigerated safe. It was riddled with bullet holes. It had significant combat damage because the Vietnamese were considering it a military target and tried to destroy it several times. So they would attack the fire base in which Michael Aquino was stationed in order to destroy this book, because with it, he was able to summon demonic voices from out of the aether, from out of the void, from out of the negative space that is outside of our dimension. And literally, it had such force, these diabolic voices, that they would knock the Viet Cong off their feet, knock them 20 feet away, throw them into the air and blow them 20 feet away whenever a diabolic scream would emit, as channeled per the spells, the rituals of Michael Aquino from his channeling of the Diabolicon. When it came to Satan appearing before him, this is, as far as I can understand, true. And Satan, of course, was originally Seth N. That was the ancient god of plagues, pestilential foreigners, the desert, the anti-god that Horus fought over Cairo. Cairo's very name means the place of battle, the battle between Horus and Set. That's portrayed in the film Gods of Egypt, which the Temple of Set ran a campaign against, so that everyone would riff on it, hate on it, and you had this monumental blockbuster film that failed because the Temple of Set put out a campaign to character assassinate the film. and they succeeded. But Gods of Egypt is really required viewing, and it's an excellent film. And it shows the defeat of Set by Horus, which the Temple of Set, of course, hates. And understand that this is how the city of Cairo got its name, place of battle, because the battle between the both that took place there. It's now, of course, effectively the capital of Egypt. So when Michael Aquino severed from the Church of Satan, there was another reason as well, far more pragmatic, far less romantic, and that was the fact that Anton Szandor LaVey hated churches. One of the reasons he hated them was because they got fat tax breaks, and so he thought this was hypocritical and obscene, and so Anton Szandor LaVey proudly paid his taxes, proudly had the Church of Satan pay taxes. Well, Michael Aquino said, I don't want none of that tax crap. He says, I want the full, shall we say, exemption from taxes that churches get. And so he had his church, his schismatic church, the Temple of Set, registered as a church that was tax exempt. And so that was another factor in his doing what he did.
We'll get to some more questions, too. I realized what I'll do is I'll read the question and come back here. 1 second. So, Allison Briscoe, and you can make this brief, but how did this affect your psyche?
It's
and I think, like psyche as in,
my soul. Yeah, basically the word psyche means soul.
Yes.
It's and psychiatrically, psychologically, I'm warped. I'm totally warped. It's like let me give you an example. David Schroeder describes in his book The Rabbit Hole. I never read it. From what I understand, it's almost like it's almost like a work in gay sado porn, like sadistic gay pornography. It is like you skim through the pages and it's like, spiked dildo, blood, etc., rectal blood, stuff like that. It's just, it looks like something I really don't need to reinforce what I already know. I'll give you an example. One of the things that I advocated for was a tampon machine in the bathroom of the Postal Library on site, the Presidio military base. And they finally installed one at my insistence. And they never asked why, but I was the only one that advocated for it. But the reason I did was because so many of the kids would come in from the daycare center being taken to the library that were bleeding. And it was just something that was an immediate way to provide them something to staunch the blood while I tried to call their parents and recommend their being taken someplace other than Letterman Army Medical Center where it was all going to be covered up.
Right.
So
the other I'm just going to give a couple of minutes for each question so we can get to them, unless some of them, because there's more to them than some of them. But this one, okay, Troubled Minds, Mr. Strange says, does Mr. Dietrich believe Satan is real, or is this simply devil worship, LARPing with the temple from the Temple of Set?
Now, understand one of the first things that the Temple of Set and other Satanists will tell you is some other motive. They'll say it's LARPing, live action role playing. They'll say this is adult Dungeons and Dragons. There is now a new Church of Satan called the Temple of Satan, I believe, or Satanic Temple. And their trip is, quote unquote, freedom of speech. And what they are claiming is that they're trying to prevent church and state from being forcibly reunited in such a way that we live under a religious tyranny. So what they try to say is that if Christians have the right to preach Christianity to children, that Satanists should also have that right. And they produce all kinds of books for children about how to sleep with animals, how to sleep with other children, how to sleep with adults. And this is like what they say are children's books. And they say this is all satire. They say this is satire because if Christians are bringing kids to Christian camps, then we can say that this is just as ridiculous. And what we're putting in your face is something to show you how ridiculous religious proselytization is using federal funding. So then they try to get federal funding for their Baphomet statue and all that. All of this, of course, is a complete and total lie. It's the facade for a very real satanic church that is truly proselytizing to children. So these churches are quite real, and these entities are quite real. But do understand the misunderstanding concerning many of these entities, and give me just a minute to explain this because it's important. Understand that one thing I learned from taking care of my parents for the last 10 years of their lives, I got a medical education the wrong way. And the one thing I learned from almost 10 years of working with Michael Aquino was I got a theological education the wrong way. So what I can tell you is that good things happen to bad people for good reason. That when it comes to these children suffering, and God's not intervening to help them, all this suffering ultimately, in a very real sense, sources from the Creator, from the divine. And it does that because the Creator created an ecosystem. And the ecosystem requires everything to cycle. So understand that when you're looking at everything you love in the universe, all of our universe, the majority of our universe is dark matter. All of this emptiness, the vacuum in space, all this blackness, so that a few flickering candles we call stars, these nuclear atomic furnaces that make life possible. Well, of that, a little bit of that material has gone out of gaseous nature into a more solid matter to become planets on which we live. So these terrestrial planets, the terrestrial planet on which we exist is such a small, infinitesimal part of the rest of the universe, so much dark matter, so much emptiness, so much of a void for a world to hold life on it. And on that world you have rainbows and puppies and flowers and everything you love. All of that, in turn, depends on dark things happening that you don't see. These flowers that blossom out of the soil are dependent on fecal matter being processed by dung beetles and carrion feeders under that soil, earthworms and dark animals you never want to see. Dark animals that if you played with, if you had, say for instance, a compost pile, you don't go playing around in a compost pile or allow your children to do so because you'd contract ringworm or an infection. But these animals in that compost pile, under the ground, they're necessary for those blossoms above the ground that you so appreciate. So understand that this is the purpose of the devils and the demons. The devils and the demons are there to torment you. They're there to taunt you. They're there to corrupt you. They're there to ultimately entice and seduce you and drag you down. But those souls that are damned, they are composting. They're recycling. They're not irredeemable. They may be down there for what feels like an eternity, but they're serving a purpose. And their composting is what makes what we appreciate in life in this dimension possible. So understand that in their own way, the devils and demons are doing God's work. Without them, we wouldn't have what we appreciate of creation. They are an essential, integral part of it, as much as any of the carrion feeders. Without flies feasting on cadavers, we would be immersed in cadavers. Without these animals that are hyenas, vultures, all the rest of those that take care of the waste products of our world, we would be mired in filth. So understand that the devils and demons are there for you. And understand this, what Michael Aquino and his cult are affiliated with, what they worship, are Edomic. These are anti-godly forces. These are entropic entities that seek the dissolution of this creation, of this universe. They seek ultimately the destruction of the devils and the demons as well as the angels. These are the equivalent of industrial waste. Unlike the regular human or animal fecal matter or waste products, plastics and industrial chemicals and industrial radiation all of these radioisotopes or chemical pollutants unleashed into our environment serve no purpose. They only destroy, they poison, they warp, and they mutate. These are the entropic entities, the anti-gods, which Aquino and his ilk worship. These are the anti-gods that, trust me,
Yeah.
the devils and demons will side with you against. This includes the fell angels such as Lucifer will stand by your side to fight against this threat.
That's amazing. I had to look at the chat again. I want to say hello to James, at Salcedo Paranormal. That's that's on the radio station too. Then Mr. Strange, then retype the question not in caps. For some reason, because I asked for caps in case there were a lot of questions, but there's just a few questions. So just write it normally then. I don't know if... Yeah, please just write it normally. And just, that's fine. Because I thought that, you know, it's better to have them in caps so you can see them out of the whole chat. Instead of... That way you don't miss any. But if it's going to mess it up, then just please go ahead and type it normally. And then, let me see here. And then... Exiled Minds podcast is here. Now, Exiled Mind podcast is also on the radio station. He says, it doesn't say, but it's connected to hotels getting sued for trafficking, mostly in Florida. That's an interesting thing. I'm not sure what... I missed the first top reference because I can't look at the whole thing, but... Oh, good. Okay. I did ask it, so... It was the question about, you know, do they really believe in these entities? Or is there a deeper, you know... Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when I was a mercenary in Africa, the Horn of Africa region, East Africa, what I ran into in those cultures was that they understood demons to be agents of retributive justice. That in that sense, you don't find many gods of mercy in Africa, not in the shamanistic or original nativist religions. You do find, however, gods of vengeance. And maybe not all gods are of vengeance. There's gods of fertility and other gods, but demons are recognized as agents of potential retributive justice that can be recruited to your cause. Just want to bring that up as a different cultural perspective. It's not necessarily what I'm recommending, but just so people understand that there's different cultural understandings or perceptions of demons where they can consider them almost as a friend or at least an ally. I want more people to grasp that concept, considering the threat we're truly facing from what the Temple of Set and the cults of the Kings of Edom are bringing into our world. With that, I'll go back to Jen and her questions.
I'll go look and see if there's any more questions. You guys, please ask any questions you might have, if you have any. Let me see. David asks this one. Do you know anything about MK Ultra victims and the connections there? MK Ultra.
Yes. Well, by the way, a house is going for sale here in San Francisco. That was an MK Ultra house where they programmed Charles Manson and a number of other celebrities. So it's selling for millions of dollars, something like $14 million. Look up the MK Ultra house selling in San Francisco, and you'll get an idea of just how familiar I am with MK Ultra. Obviously, what I saw was MK Ultra in action. And I do want people to understand that a good example of this is someone like David Schroeder hates my guts. And he hates my guts because he feels that when I showed up on the scene, Aquino stopped paying attention to him. Yet he'll write in his book, and I'm not coming down on him, but he'll write in his book how he witnessed Michael Aquino skewer infants, babies, roast them on an open spit, and eat them. You're talking about a guy who's witnessing this level of abuse, and yet he feels somehow cheated that Michael Aquino stopped abusing him when I showed up on the scene because Michael Aquino found me so compelling or attractive. This is something that is an example of MK Ultra. This is the, you know, so...
it's all connected to MK Ultra because it's all tied, yes. Another question, let's see. Hidden Doors Hotels Phone Trafficking Ad Lawsuit. So Exiled Minds podcasts, again, he's talking about Hidden Doors in hotels found. and that, you know, these hotels might have been trafficking down Florida about the children trafficking. And then YY asked, who of these kids escaped these horrors to grow up and become whistleblowers? Any books? So have any of these kids that escaped these horrors, if they did, have they grown up to become whistleblowers or write any books that you're aware of?
Most of them are left so incoherent, so mentally ravaged by what happened to them, that they really don't have the capacity to communicate. David Schroeder is an example of writing his book, The Rabbit Hole, of an exception to the rule. But if you were to speak to him personally, I would wager that you would probably find him fairly incoherent, or probably could not follow him for too long. Probably his company would be very hard to keep. Most of these people are so damaged that they're effectively desocialized, and therefore cannot express their victimization. Here's a good example. When Michael Aquino was on Oprah Winfrey, there was a young man who came up from the audience and said that Michael Aquino abused me. And he said right there in front of God and everybody, national television, with Oprah Winfrey holding a mic to his face, Michael Aquino made me kill people. He said Michael Aquino made me commit crimes. And of course, then they focused the camera on Michael Aquino, and you can see Michael Aquino just moving his lips. Like, basically, the first thing Michael Aquino did was he challenged the young man. And of course, from his position of authority and power, nobody could fight back. Here's why. He just said quite logically, "Why didn't you call the police?" And so here's this young man who's just confessed to murder. And Michael Aquino throws it back on him. "Why didn't you call the police?" Well, he can't call the police, because he would be arrested for murder, which you made him commit. As Michael Aquino used to say, I use stupid people the way stupid people use guns. But then when the young man was trying to explain where this happened, because Oprah Winfrey says, "Where did it happen?" Then the camera actually turned towards Michael Aquino, and you see his lips move, and he's looking at the young man. He's saying he doesn't remember. You see him mouth it. He doesn't remember that. Then the boy who sees that, he goes, "I don't remember." And so he's made to look like a fool, making up stories.
Mm-hmm.
So you see what these people are facing. What they're facing is a programming that compartmentalizes their experiences so that when somebody earnestly questions them, they're unable to back up their stories. This is part of the programming which disables their ability to write a book. Say they're trying to talk to a co-author. Say somebody sits down and says, "Okay, I'll help you write a book." They're unable to get it out in such a fashion that this person can work with, because the person's going to wind up saying, "You know what? I'm going to wind up getting sued for slander, for defamation of character.
Right.
So I can't do this without evidence. And so you're going to have to tell me where you killed this person, at which point the person's going to be guilty of murder themselves, and they're going to go to jail. So then they have to shut down." You see what I'm saying? This is what happens. This is why you don't get what you got with David Schroeder. He's the exception that proves the rule. There may be others. And when they happen, there was a man who wrote, he was in the Navy. He was in the U.S. Navy, and he wrote a book about Satanism. For those of you who don't know, by the way, there was a satanic funeral held in San Francisco. When Anton Szandor LaVey established the first Church of Satan, it was for a U.S. Navy sailor. This showed you then already the influence over the military. So when a sailor wrote a book about being a Satanist in the Navy, he wound up being character assassinated. They forced him to ultimately retract what he said. The reason that I'm so suppressed, anybody who's with us tonight, understand you are privileged. I'm banned off Facebook. I'm not allowed a Wikipedia page. I am somebody who this courageous young lady, Jennifer Hawkins, has done her best to interview, and they did their damnedest to stop her from doing so tonight. Believe me, this was a technical assault on multiple levels. My side, her side.
That was pretty intense. I will say that. Yeah. That was like I had to go get I had to shut everything down, and then I contacted Mr. Strange, and I was like, I don't know, and we did get it sorted out because it was something to do. It was I don't know. I had to reboot everything.
Ultimately, I will tell you, whatever it was, ultimately it was a combination of NSA and the occult. Don't think that that could happen on your side, my side.
It was fine yesterday.
All the echoes?
You know, like yesterday we did it and it was perfectly fine, and then it seemed like it was gonna be fine, and then it was just it was unbelievable. But El Nemo asked in the chat too. Did Anton LaVey ever realize that Michael Aquino was a spy, basically, or that he was infiltrating it on purpose?
Yes, he did, and that's ultimately why he severed, why they part of their severance. Anton Szandor LaVey did. Now, I do want to emphasize something to people. Anton Szandor LaVey was not a good guy.
No.
A lot of people try to think of him as just this kind of positive Satanist as opposed to Michael Aquino, and that's just absurd. So, we can go into the details of that another time, but I just want to toss that out there.
Let me see. Please post your questions. It doesn't have to be all in caps. I just said that because I thought it'd be easier to catch them, but that's going to they're not posting them if they're in caps, so just write them normally.
By the way, as Brendan points out, Brendan entered a little comment into our text box here. He said, the original ancient Greek word, daemon, did not carry negative connotations as it denotes a spirit or divine power. The Greek conception of a daemon notably appears in philosophical works of Plato, where it describes the divine inspiration of Socrates. So understand that the Greeks had a term eudaimonia. EU means good, like eugenics means breeding up, good breeding. So eudaimonia meant that you were in high spirits. Just some further context there. Now, hopefully people don't get the idea that I'm promoting my own form of Satanism or diabolatry. The term would be diabolatry, the worship of devils and demons. It's not what I'm doing.
Right.
What I'm implying is that you have to understand this is an ecosystem, and that without elements of the ecosystem, creation collapses. The ecosystem collapses when elements are taken away. If you were to destroy termites or ants, as horrible as they are, and I don't like either species, it would impact our ecosystems profoundly. Certainly we appreciate honeybees because we like what they produce, but there's other species that are just as valuable or integral. So any other questions you might find, Jen, by all means.
Let me see if they did post any more.
Sure.
Do you guys have any more questions at all? Otherwise, I'll ask you a couple of questions myself, or we'll just get back to talking just a little while, and then I probably better, get myself around to probably, to resting, and then
of course.
But I want to,
We're gonna make this happen again, I presume. We're gonna do further interviews. Let's make this a thing.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. Okay.
Yes.
Does anybody have any more questions? Jay asked, how many kids do you think are part of the program?
Let's say this. I want everybody to understand that when I shut down the Presidio military base and consequently shut down the largest human child trafficking operation in the world, which was operated by the U.S. Army in particular, but all other branches of service tangentially. I want people to understand that the military retorted by damage control. They established what's called the Month of the Military Child. And if you ever take a look at the Month of the Military Child, it's in April, look up the Month of the Military Child, ask yourself when it started. You'll find out it started after the Presidio military base was closed, after Dietrich had it shut down. This was their damage control that they put through Congress. And then you'll see them bragging about our thousands of daycare centers. Thousands are the role model for daycare centers worldwide. I mean, first off, ask yourself this question. We all know that war is essentially inescapable. We know that nation states ultimately need militaries. It's silly to say they don't, because obviously if you don't, other nations will march in. We do know that there are warrior cultures, the Junkers of Germany, the samurai of Japan. America does not have that. It has what's called a quote-unquote professional military. Well, whatever military you got, understand that the whole purpose of a military, I'm certain we all agree, is to break things and kill people. Otherwise, you don't have a military. You've got something like a Peace Corps. So if you want to help people in humanitarian aid, you develop a Peace Corps, something like that. But a military, it's to break things and kill people. And I think we can all agree that whatever else a war machine might be, it should never be a family environment. So when you've got the U.S. military touting the month of the military child and bragging about we got thousands of daycare centers all over the world and, oh, they're the model for daycare centers worldwide, ask yourself, why? Why does our military have daycare centers? The very insanity of what I'm saying should echo through your mind and force you to confront the insanity of the military junta which runs your culture. So this is what needs to be confronted is how many children? Too many. But one thing I can tell you, when I was involved with the military, thousands of children were being trafficked. We had a daycare center that was capable of caring for 1,500 children at any given time. And we had families transferring in and out of the Presidio military base regularly. So at any given time, you'd have 1,000 kids in this daycare center. And the 100 kids that were infected by Gary Willard Hambright alone, think of all the others infected by so many other people participating in this abuse, this pimping out of children to people who came in to have sex with them, which is what the kids were reporting, being taken home to other people's homes, being taken home to Aquino's home. You have these kids by the thousands in Presidio alone, and we're talking on a regular basis. So ultimately, I'd have to say the tens of thousands of kids were essentially trafficked, pimped out, prostituted via the Presidio daycare center system. And you put in all the other military bases, think of what I described at West Point. Ask yourself, have you ever seen, in general, like a politician or some quote-unquote successful individual who said, I was raised on a military base? Have you ever met anyone ever in your life who has ever said, I was raised on a military base? Now, the scary thing is, there are people who are born on a base and die on a base. These people exist. Are they anyone you would ever want to meet? I would wager not. They're the product of a sick welfare state in which they're born on a base, join the military, die on a base. This is not healthy. This is your professional military. That's not professionalism, that's a cult. What you have is an armed cult that is effectively running your nation as a junta, running your culture. So I would say that pretty much every child that is born into the system is in one way or another a part of that system, exploited. If they're not being directly abused, they wind up enabling a system that condones and expedites and ultimately traffics in this abuse.
I think next time too we'll go into about the finders and about a lot of that.
Yes.
But we'll have to have that for another time.
Absolutely.
And we'll schedule that. I think.
Yes.
I think everyone has. Okay. I hope you guys enjoyed this stream, Mr. Dietrich. Please tell them about your books real quick, and where they can find those. Tell them about your website, and then and about your own YouTube channel that you run, and any other information where they can find more.
Thank you. thanks to Jennifer Hawkins, the young lady who made this possible. She's a hero, and make certain you maintain her in thoughts and prayers. She will come under further attack or approach by these elements in the future, I'm sure. But I also know she's strong and stands against them. With your help, your thoughts and prayers, she'll stay strong and resist the call of Cthulhu, the call of chaos. So when it comes to myself, I have a website that I'm no longer really putting anything on, but I will. I hope to ultimately return to doing so.
It's full of all kinds of information, though. Incredible.
Yes, it has articles, and by all means, access those articles that are on there. By all means, thank you, Jennifer. And yeah, so DouglasDietrich.com. So that's easy. DouglasDietrich.com. And aside from that, my YouTube channel is Douglas Dietrich. So yeah, look up Douglas Dietrich on YouTube. When you find the Asian guy, you know you're there. The Asian guy with blue eyes. It's actually Alexandria's Genesis. They're actually more of a shade of phosphate purple or something. but
they're lovely. Yeah.
Oh, you're very kind. Oh, bless you, honey. Yes. And you're gorgeous.
It's been wonderful having you to visit. And your books.
Yes, my books. The Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II. That's a single book with.
We're going to get into that too sometime. I hope I can interview about a lot of that.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, and so the Roswell Deception. Look that up on Amazon or buy it from Skybooks USA, and also Vampirology, spelled VAMPHYR. Ology, yeah. So Vampirology, and that is again Amazon.com or Skybooks USA. Yeah, might as well order it directly from Skybooks USA when you can. Amazon, fine. You know, just make certain that you spread the word. And by all means, Nemo says, could you tell the listeners to look up DDD Archive 1 and 2 on Odyssey? So yes, Odyssey.com. I do want people to understand that there's been a backup of a lot of my videos that are no longer on YouTube or censored by YouTube. So this is on Odyssey to find more of my content. DDD Archive, that's D.D. apparently no dot. D.D. Archive 1 and 2 on Odyssey. Now, one of these is from John Warrington, I believe, or they might both be by Nemo Albano. So he's typing some more stuff here. Jennifer, you have the patience of a saint. I pray you get enough rest. Are you going to get enough rest tonight before your work tomorrow?
It'll be fine. It'll be fine.
And I do want people to understand, she will remind us, Jennifer will remind us the next time she and I are getting together, which hopefully will be within a month or two. We're going to talk also about Frank Borman, what he had to do with Aquino and Mae Brussel, and how I had to contact him and Mae Brussel both, and how Michael Aquino was attempting to destroy them both, and why. And so we'll get into that next time, as well as the time that Michael Aquino sent me to the Soviet Union. So I was dispatched to the Soviet Union to meet Alexander Dugin, who was a guest oftentimes of Alex Jones, and who was also often introduced by Alex Jones as Putin's brain, and also how I was interviewed by Sean Stone, who wound up converting to Michael Aquino's cause. His father Oliver Stone became an Aquino acolyte by force. Basically, Aquino got control of Oliver Stone through his son Sean Stone, because his son compromised himself by repeating what I had to say without context on Alex Jones, which got him compromised by Michael Aquino. So all that, hopefully, we'll remember next time. I'm just saying this so we can write it down.
I am going to, and then we'll come back to it. So we're not picking up or repeat, going. So we're kind of just going to pick it up right here, not right here directly, but we're going to begin to address those things and go further into, because there's so much more about the occult in World War II, and then more about the Temple of. There's just so much. There's just so much, actually, and this could have gone on. But for me, it's, for me, go ahead.
Yeah, for you.
Go.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm sorry, before I forgot, before it dribbles out of my ears, we do want to remind people that both Julian Assange was connected to an Aquino-run cult as well, Shanti Nikoton in Australia. We'll get into that, hopefully, as well as Michael Snowden's connection, or Edward Snowden's connection. I can't even remember his full name. I try to bleach it out of my mind. But please, let's Jennifer have the last word. Believe me, I can't thank you enough. You're incredible.
No,
What you
you
went
are.
through
I was
tonight.
actually going to say that you're incredible. And everything, this information is just, I want to say again, whenever I found, I couldn't believe that I had, was able to get to talk with you. I think people don't understand like how incredible to be hearing these accounts from you are. It's invaluable it's amazing, priceless information that that you have. And what's interesting is I've taken everything that I have heard you reference to and mention, and I have looked up since we've been visiting over the last couple of weeks or so, looked up so much of this, and it's just unbelievable, just the level of this, the information that you have. And I hope that we will. And so I appreciate it so much, and thank you so much for sharing it with everyone. And I'm very glad that I know this was tedious and that it did not go smoothly at first, but I promise you it. I think I hope the next time it will be easier to get started with it, and then we can just continue to hear your experiences.
Let's put it this way, Jennifer. What our audience needs to understand is we're going to hope for the best, but you've all got to expect the worst. Because when it comes to any time we try to initiate these discussions, the enemy does everything they can to discourage us. They want to destroy our morale so that we never do this again. This is why they attack all sides in terms of the technological communications. This is NSA at work. So this is truly a technical assault, and it's a dedicated cyber assault, and they have the means of doing this. And it also involves a form of occult attack as well. Don't not doubt that. That's simply a form of applied quantum mechanics.
And we will
So,
have to get into that too. I wish we could get into that right now, but I think but otherwise, because that's gonna, but I really want to give it a lot of time to hear that, what you're gonna say about the quantum mechanics of the magic itself, so that people can hear a lot about the nine angled circle, and just the way that more about that. And I think we could go into a little of that, and you could explain some of that to people in a way,
of course,
if you'd like. That'd be incredible.
I'd be happy to. And Jen, you're an angel. You're more than Earth deserves.
You're amazing,
okay?
Mr. Dietrich, and thank you so much. And I'm gonna come over here, and I'll probably let me make sure there's nobody. Let me see. I think everybody really enjoyed this, and you guys have a great night. And thank you so much for staying with us. This is again, I'm Jen Arcana with the Troubled Minds Radio Network, KUAP, and this was Mr. Douglas Dietrich, first interview. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, day, morning, and thank you so much for being with us. Good night.